The bucket of water tipped over and soaked the marble floor just as the heavy doors of the private study swung open. Elena froze, her knees pressed into the cold stone, her hands still gripping the cloth she had been using to wipe down the shelves. She had been told the king was away at the northern border that morning. She had been told the room would be empty. It was not empty. A tall man stood in the doorway, wrapped in a dark green coat that fell to his knees, his eyes sweeping the room the way a hunter studies a forest, before deciding whether to step into it. Elena had never stood this close to Alpha King Damien before. From a distance, across the great hall, he looked like a painting brought to life, still and commanding. Up close, he looked dangerous, in a way paintings never could. "Who let you in here?" he asked, his voice low and even, giving nothing away. Elena scrambled to her feet, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Forgive me, my lord. I was told this study would be free this morning. I did not know you had returned." He studied her for a long moment, longer than necessary for a simple explanation. Elena felt her face grow warm under his stare, and looked down at the spreading puddle of water, instead of meeting his eyes. Servants who looked too long at the king were servants who did not last long in the palace. She had learned that rule during her first month here, 3 years ago, and she had never broken it since. "Clean it up," he said finally, stepping around the puddle without another glance at her, moving toward the desk stacked with letters and maps. "And be quick. I have matters that need quiet." "Yes, my lord." Elena dropped back to her knees and began mopping up the water with quick, practiced strokes, grateful for the excuse to keep her head down. Her hands trembled slightly, though she told herself it was only the cold water and not the presence of the man now sitting at the desk, only a few feet away from her. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the palace had. Alpha King Damien, ruler of the Northern Territory, had taken the throne young, after his father died suddenly, during a border conflict 5 years before. He had spent every year since, defending the kingdom's borders, and rebuilding what the wars had broken. He had never married. He had never even courted anyone publicly, which the kitchen staff whispered about endlessly during their short breaks between meals. Some said he was waiting for his fated mate, the one bond that could never be forced or faked among his kind. Others said he simply had no room in his heart for anything but duty. Elena had never had an opinion on the matter. Kings and their hearts were not things that touched her life. She swept floors. She scrubbed pots. She kept her head down and her thoughts to herself. And in 3 years, that formula had kept her safe. She finished wiping the floor and gathered her bucket, rising to leave as quietly as she had entered. She was almost at the door when the king spoke again. "Wait." Elena stopped, her back still to him, her hand resting on the doorframe. "My lord? There is a book on the shelf behind you. Blue cover, the one with the gold lettering. Bring it to me." She turned and scanned the shelf until she found it, a heavy old volume with a cracked spine. She lifted it carefully and carried it to the desk, holding it out with both hands, the way she had been trained to present anything to nobility, without letting her fingers linger too close to theirs. Damien reached for the book. Their hands met at the edge of the cover, only for a moment, only the barest brush of skin against skin. The room seemed to tilt. Elena felt it before she understood what it was, a jolt that ran up through her fingers and settled somewhere deep in her chest, warm and sudden and impossible to explain. Her breath caught. She pulled her hand back too quickly, and the book nearly slipped from Damien's grip as well, though his eyes had gone wide and fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "My lord?" she said, unsure why her voice had gone so quiet. He did not answer right away. His jaw was tight, his gaze locked on her face, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that had appeared out of nowhere. For a moment, Elena thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, though she was certain they had never spoken before this morning. "Nothing," he said finally, setting the book down without opening it. "You may go." Elena did not need to be told twice. She gathered her bucket and cloth and left the study as quickly as decorum allowed, her heart still racing, her fingers still tingling where they had touched his. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself it was only nerves, the natural fear of standing too close to a man who held the power of life and death over everyone in his territory. By the time she reached the servants' hall and set her bucket down beside the others, she had almost convinced herself of it. Almost. Because deep in her chest, something had shifted, something warm and quiet that refused to fade no matter how hard she tried to push it away. Damien sat alone in the study, long after the maid had gone, the blue book untouched on the desk in front of him. His hands were still steady, his breathing controlled, the careful discipline of a man who had spent years training himself never to show weakness. But inside, something had cracked open that he had not felt in a very long time. He had touched hundreds of hands in his years as king. Council members offering reports, nobles bowing in greeting, soldiers saluting before battle. None of them had ever made the ground shift beneath him the way that single accidental touch had. He knew what it meant. Every wolf in his bloodline knew the signs from childhood stories told by firelight, passed down through generations who had waited, sometimes for a lifetime, for the one bond that could never be chosen, only found. The mate bond, the pull that could not be explained by logic, only felt, sudden and undeniable, the moment two fated souls came into contact. He had stopped believing it would happen to him. 5 years he had ruled this territory, and in that time, he had met countless women presented to him by ambitious families, hoping to secure a match with the crown. He had shaken their hands, danced with them at feasts, sat through polite dinners arranged by his council. Nothing. Not once had he felt so much as a flicker of what had just passed through him in the space of a single accidental touch, with a servant girl he did not even know the name of. A servant girl. The thought unsettled something in him, though he could not decide if it was disbelief or something closer to shame at his own hesitation. Fate did not care about titles or birth. He knew that. His own grandmother had been a healer's daughter before she caught his grandfather's eye, and their bond had been sung about in ballads for 2 generations. And yet the practical part of his mind, the part shaped by years of council meetings and political marriages proposed by nervous advisors, could not help but calculate what this would mean. A palace maid, elevated to the king's mate. The nobility would not accept it easily. Some would try to fight it. He pushed the thought aside and rose from the desk, moving to the window that overlooked the training grounds below. He needed to know more before he did anything rash. He needed to know her name, at the very least. He called for his beta, Corin, a broad-shouldered man who had served at his side since they were boys training together in the same yard. Corin arrived within minutes, his expression sharpening the moment he saw the look on Damien's face. "Something happened," Corin said, not a question. "Find out the name of the maid who was cleaning this study an hour ago," Damien said, keeping his voice level despite the storm building behind his ribs. "Dark hair, brown eyes, works somewhere in the eastern wing, I believe. Find out everything about her, quietly. I do not want this reaching the council yet." Corin's eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not ask questions, not yet. Years of loyalty had taught him, when his king needed silence more than curiosity. "I will find her," he said simply, and left the room without another word. Damien remained at the window, watching the soldiers train below without truly seeing them, his mind circling back again and again to the moment their hands had touched. He told himself it might have been a mistake, a trick of nerves, or exhaustion after his long ride from the border. He told himself many things over the following hour. None of them convinced him. Elena spent the rest of her day in a strange fog, moving through her usual tasks without truly paying attention to any of them. She scrubbed the kitchen floors after the midday meal. She carried linens to the laundry house across the courtyard. She helped an older maid named Ruth fold fresh sheets in the storage room, nodding along to Ruth's usual complaints about the head housekeeper, without really hearing a word of it. Her mind kept drifting back to the study, to the warmth that had rushed through her at the moment their hands touched, to the strange look that had crossed the king's face right before he told her to leave. She had seen fear in that look, or something close to it, though she could not imagine what a man with his power could possibly be afraid of. "You're somewhere else today," Ruth said, snapping a sheet straight with practiced hands. "What happened?" "Nothing," Elena said quickly, perhaps too quickly, because Ruth gave her a knowing look and did not press further, though her eyes lingered a moment longer than usual. Elena had learned long ago not to share more than necessary with anyone in the palace, even the kindest of the staff. She had arrived here at 16, alone, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a grief she had never spoken aloud to a single living soul. The village she had grown up in, tucked against the eastern hills near the old border, no longer existed. It had been destroyed in a raid during the territory conflicts 5 years ago, the same conflicts that had claimed the old king's life and put young Damien on the throne before he was ready for the weight of it. Elena did not remember much of that night with any clarity, only fire and smoke and the sound of her mother's voice telling her to run and not look back. She had run. She had kept running until a trading caravan found her half-starved on the road and brought her to the capital, where the palace had taken her in as kitchen help, simply because they needed hands, and she had 2 of them. She had never told anyone the full truth of what happened that night. Not Ruth, not the head housekeeper, no one. It was easier to let people assume she was simply an orphan from a poor village, easier than explaining the parts of that night that still visited her in dreams, the parts she did not fully understand even now. She finished her shift as the sun began to set, exhaustion pulling at her shoulders as she made her way back to the small room she shared with 2 other maids in the servants' quarters. She had almost reached the door when a voice stopped her in the corridor. Elena turned to find a broad-shouldered man approaching, his bearing marking him instantly as someone of importance, though she did not recognize his face. "Yes, sir. What is your name?" She hesitated, an old instinct rising in her chest, the same caution that had kept her alive on the road all those years ago. "Elena," she said finally. "Elena Marsh. I work in the Eastern Wing, sir. Have I done something wrong?" The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before shaking his head slightly. "No, nothing wrong. I simply needed to confirm a name." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her once more with an expression she could not quite place, something between curiosity and caution. "Get some rest, Elena Marsh." He was gone before she could ask anything further, disappearing down the corridor toward the main hall. Elena stood alone in the dim light, a cold unease settling over her despite the warmth of the evening air. Someone important had just learned her name, and she had no idea why, or what it might mean for the careful, quiet life she had built for herself within these walls. She thought of the king's eyes again, the way they had fixed on her in that final moment before he told her to leave, and a small, unwelcome voice in the back of her mind whispered that her quiet life might not stay quiet for very much longer. She pushed the thought away, entered her room, and lay awake long after her roommates had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and listening to her own heartbeat, unable to explain why it still had not slowed since that morning. Corin returned to the king's private chambers, just after midnight, finding Damien still awake, seated near the cold hearth with a cup of untouched wine on the table beside him. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the stone walls, but Damien had not bothered to call for a servant to build it back up. He wanted no one else in the room while he waited. "Her name is Elena Marsh," Corin said, closing the door behind him. "She has worked in the palace for 3 years, since she was 16. She came here with a trading caravan that found her alone on the Eastern Road. Before that, her records are unclear. The housekeeper who took her in said she claimed to be from a village near the old border, but there is no family listed, no relatives to speak of. She keeps to herself, works hard, causes no trouble. The other maids like her well enough, though none of them claim to know her closely." Damien listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the dying embers in the hearth. "The eastern border," he repeated quietly. "That region was hit hard during the conflicts 5 years ago." "It was," Corin said, watching his king carefully. "Several villages there were destroyed in the raids before your father fell. It is possible she lost her family in that same fighting." Something tightened in Damien's chest at the thought. He had spent 5 years carrying the weight of those wars, the decisions his father had made, and the ones Damien himself had been forced to make, in the chaos that followed his father's death. He had told himself many times that he had done everything he could to protect his people, and yet here was a woman, perhaps a survivor of the very devastation his kingdom had failed to prevent, standing in his study earlier that day, as though fate had chosen this exact moment to place her in his path. "You believe this is her," Corin said carefully, no longer bothering to phrase it as a question. He had known Damien too long not to recognize the signs, the restless energy beneath his king's usual composure, the way his eyes had not truly settled since he called for this meeting. "I do not know what I believe," Damien said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I felt something, a pull, when our hands touched. I have never felt anything like it before, not with any woman my council has paraded in front of me over the years." Corin was quiet for a long moment, choosing his next words with the caution of a man who understood exactly how much was at stake. "If it is a true bond, my lord, you know what that means. It cannot be denied. It cannot be replaced by another match, no matter what the council prefers. Our people have never survived long, happy reigns built on ignoring a true bond. You know the old stories as well as I do." "I know them," Damien said, a trace of frustration slipping into his voice for the first time. "I also know what the council will say. A servant girl, with no family name, no lineage to speak of, elevated to sit beside the throne, Lady Seraphine's family alone will not accept it quietly. They have spent 2 years positioning her as the likely match for the crown." "Since when have you cared what Lady Seraphine's family wants?" Corin asked, a note of dry humor slipping into his tone despite the seriousness of the conversation. Despite himself, Damien felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the first genuine flicker of amusement he had allowed himself all day. "I have never cared," he admitted. "But I have also never had to test whether the council's patience with my choices has limits. This will test it." "Then test it," Corin said simply. "You are the Alpha King. The bond was given to you by something greater than any council seat. If this Elena Marsh is truly your mate, no title in this kingdom outranks that truth, and every wolf within our territory will understand it, even if they grumble about it first." Damien said nothing for a long while, staring into the last embers of the fire as they crumbled slowly into ash. He thought of the girl's face when their hands had touched, the way her eyes had widened with the same shock that had rushed through him, the way she had pulled back as though burned, clearly as confused and unprepared for what had happened as he was. She did not know what she was to him. She likely did not even understand what a mate bond truly meant, not in the way his own people understood it from birth. He would have to be careful. He would have to be patient, in a way he had rarely been forced to practice in his years of ruling through decisiveness and quick, certain judgment. "Say nothing of this to the council yet," Damien said finally, rising from his chair. "Not until I understand it fully myself. I will need to see her again, to be certain this was not some trick of exhaustion after the ride from the border." "And if it is not a trick?" Corin asked. "If it is real?" Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening with the same resolve his people had come to rely on since the day he took the throne. "Then I will do what fate demands of me, whatever the cost to the council's comfort. I did not ask to be given a mate born into servitude, but I will not be the king who turns away from what is truly mine, simply because it is inconvenient for the men who sit at my table." Corin nodded once, satisfied, and left the king alone with his thoughts and the last of the dying fire. Across the palace grounds, in the small room she shared with 2 sleeping roommates, Elena finally drifted into a restless sleep, unaware that the man who ruled her entire world had just made a quiet, private vow that would soon change the shape of her life forever. She dreamed, as she often did, of fire and smoke, and her mother's voice calling her to run. But for the first time in years, another image drifted through the dream as well, faint and strange. A pair of steady eyes watching her from across a quiet room, eyes that did not look away even when she wanted them to. She woke before dawn with her heart pounding, and no memory of why, only a lingering warmth in her chest that she could not explain, and a growing, uneasy certainty that whatever had happened in that study yesterday was only the beginning of something far larger than she was prepared for. 3 days passed before Elena was summoned again, and in those 3 days she convinced herself, almost completely, that the strange encounter in the study had been nothing more than a passing oddity, the kind of thing that happened when nerves and exhaustion collided at the wrong moment. She threw herself into her work with even more focus than usual, scrubbing floors until her knuckles ached, folding linens until her shoulders burned, anything to keep her mind too busy to wander back to that room and the warmth that had rushed through her fingers. It did not work as well as she hoped. On the 4th morning, a young page found her in the laundry courtyard and told her, breathless from running, that the head housekeeper wanted to see her immediately. Elena's stomach dropped. Summons like this rarely meant good news for a maid. She followed the page through the servants' corridors, running through every possible mistake she might have made, every dish she might have chipped, every task she might have left unfinished. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Margaret who ran the Eastern Wing staff with the precision of a military commander, was waiting in her small office, with an expression Elena could not quite read. "You have been requested," Margaret said, folding her hands in front of her, "by the king himself. You are to attend him in the private garden this afternoon." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Requested? For what purpose? "That is not something either of us needs to question," Margaret said, though her eyes lingered on Elena a moment longer than usual, curious and faintly suspicious. "You will bathe, put on a clean uniform, and be at the garden gate by the second bell. Do not keep him waiting." Elena left the office in a daze, her mind spinning through every possible explanation. Had she done something wrong in the study that day? Had someone reported her for lingering too long, for looking at the king when she should have kept her eyes down? She could think of nothing else that would explain a direct summons from the crown to a maid who had never before been noticed by anyone above the rank of head housekeeper. She bathed quickly, changed into her cleanest uniform, and made her way to the private garden with her heart hammering against her ribs the entire walk. The garden itself was a place she had only seen from a distance before, tucked behind the eastern wing and reserved exclusively for the royal family. Tall hedges bordered winding stone paths, and flowering vines climbed trellises that arched overhead like quiet green tunnels. It was beautiful in a way that felt entirely separate from the rest of the palace, hushed and private, a world apart from the noise of the kitchens and the endless bustle of the servants' halls. Damien was waiting near a small fountain at the center of the garden, dressed more simply than she had seen him before, without the heavy formal coat he usually wore for council meetings. He looked younger like this, less like the distant figure painted in portraits throughout the palace, and more like an ordinary man, standing quietly beside the water. "You wish to see me, my lord?" Elena asked, stopping a respectful distance away, and lowering her eyes as she had been trained. "I did," Damien said. "Come closer. I do not bite." There was a faint, dry humor in his voice that caught her off guard. She stepped closer, though she kept her eyes fixed somewhere near his shoulder, rather than meeting his gaze directly. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, "and I would like an honest answer, without fear of consequence, whatever it might be." Elena's throat tightened. "Of course, my lord. When we touched, in the study, did you feel anything unusual?" The question hit her like cold water. She had spent 3 days convincing herself it had all been nerves, and now the king himself was asking her to confirm the very thing she had been trying so hard to dismiss. She hesitated, unsure how honesty might be received, unsure what answer would keep her safest. "I felt something," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know what it was. A warmth. It surprised me." Damien let out a slow breath, as though her answer had confirmed something he had already suspected but needed to hear spoken aloud. He stepped closer, close enough that Elena had to fight the urge to step back, and held out his hand, palm up, between them. "May I?" he asked. She did not fully understand what he was asking, but something in his tone told her this mattered more than simple politeness. She lifted her own hand slowly and placed it in his. The same jolt rushed through her instantly, stronger this time, unmistakable, spreading from her fingers up through her arm and settling deep in her chest with a warmth that made her breath catch audibly. Damien's grip tightened slightly around her hand, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her knees feel unsteady. "That is not ordinary," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "That has never happened to me before, not with anyone." "What does it mean?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she could not say. Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as though searching for the right words, or perhaps searching for permission to say them at all. "Among my people," he said finally, "there is a bond that cannot be chosen or arranged, no matter how powerful a family or how careful a match. It finds two people on its own, and when it does, it cannot be denied or replaced. We call it the mate bond." It is rare. Some wolves live their entire lives and never feel it at all. Elena's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was telling her, though a cold unease was already spreading through her chest. And you believe that this is what happened between us? I believe it, Damien said. I have never felt anything like this before, not once in 5 years of meetings arranged by my council, not with any woman presented to me as a possible match for the crown. I felt it the moment our hands touched in the study, and I feel it again now, stronger than before. Elena pulled her hand back slowly, her thoughts spinning too fast to hold on to any single one. My lord, I am a maid. I clean floors and fold linens. I have no family name, no lineage, nothing to offer a king. The bond does not care about lineage, Damien said, though his voice had gained a careful gentleness she had not expected from him. It does not care about titles or wealth or the opinions of my council. It chose you, whether either of us is prepared for what that means. Elena felt panic rising in her chest, sharp and sudden. She had spent 3 years building a quiet, careful life within these walls, a life built on being unnoticed, on staying safely invisible among the staff who came and went, without drawing attention from anyone above them. The thought of being noticed by the king, truly noticed, in a way that could never be undone, terrified her more than she could easily explain. I do not understand why this is happening to me, she said, her voice shaking now. I did not ask for this. Neither did I, Damien said, but I do not intend to run from it, and I would ask that you do not either, at least not yet. Give me the chance to prove that this does not have to be something you fear. Elena looked up at him then, truly looked at him for the first time since she had entered the garden, and found none of the coldness she had expected from a man who ruled an entire territory with unquestioned authority. Instead, she found something almost pleading in his eyes, a rare vulnerability that seemed strange coming from someone so powerful. I need time, she said finally, the only honest answer she could offer. This is too much to understand all at once. Then take the time you need, Damien said. I will not force anything on you that you are not ready for. But I ask that you do not disappear from me either. Whatever this bond means for both of us, I would like the chance to discover it slowly, rather than losing it before we have even begun. Elena nodded slowly, unable to find any further words, and Damien, sensing she had reached the edge of what she could handle in a single conversation, stepped back and allowed her the space to breathe. You may return to your duties, he said gently. But I would like to speak with you again, when you are ready. Perhaps in a few days' time. Yes, my lord, Elena said, and turned to leave the garden, her legs carrying her forward on instinct alone, while her mind remained frozen on everything he had just told her. She made it back to the servants' quarters in a haze, barely registering the familiar corridors around her, and did not fully return to herself until she was alone in the small room she shared with her 2 roommates, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, with her hands still trembling in her lap. A mate bond, the king's mate. The words felt impossible, even as she turned them over in her mind, entirely disconnected from the quiet, careful life she had built for herself, brick by brick, since the night her village burned and her mother's voice told her to run. She had spent 3 years making herself small, unnoticed, safe. And now the most powerful man in the territory was telling her that fate itself had chosen her, whether she wanted it or not. She did not sleep well that night, her mind circling endlessly between fear and something else she refused to name, something warm and dangerous that had settled deep in her chest the moment their hands touched in the garden and refused to fade no matter how tightly she tried to hold herself together. Somewhere across the palace grounds, in his private chambers, Damien stood at his window long into the night, watching the stars over the training grounds, filled with a strange mixture of hope and fear he had not expected to feel as strongly as he did. He had told her the truth. Now all that remained was the far harder task of proving to her that the truth did not have to be something to run from before the rest of the palace discovered what he already knew and before anyone with the power to interfere had the chance to try. What Elena did not know, as she lay awake in the dark that night, was that her walk to and from the private garden had not gone entirely unnoticed. Lady Seraphine, daughter of one of the oldest and most influential families in the territory, had been crossing the eastern courtyard on her way to a council luncheon when she spotted a young maid in a freshly cleaned uniform slipping through the garden gate, escorted by no one, expected by someone important enough to warrant private access to the king's personal grounds. Seraphine had stopped mid-step, watching the gate close, a small frown creasing her otherwise carefully composed features. She had spent the better part of 2 years cultivating her position at court, attending every feast, every council dinner, every occasion where she might be seen beside the king, and remembered favorably by the families who would one day help decide who sat beside the throne. She was not a woman who missed details, and the sight of a servant girl being personally escorted to the private garden was not a detail she intended to ignore. She continued to the luncheon, smiling and gracious as always, giving no outward sign that anything had troubled her. But her mind turned the image over and over throughout the meal, and by the time the last course had been cleared away, she had already decided to have someone quietly look into who the girl was and why she had been granted access to a place reserved for family and the king's closest confidants. She found her answer more easily than expected. A cousin who worked among the palace stewards mentioned, almost in passing during a conversation about staffing changes, that a maid named Elena Marsh from the Eastern Wing had been summoned by name to attend the king directly, an unusual occurrence that had already generated a small amount of curious gossip among the household staff. Seraphine said nothing in response beyond a polite, distracted nod, but inside, a cold and calculating clarity had begun to settle over her thoughts. She did not yet know what the summons meant. She intended to find out, and she intended to be prepared for whatever she discovered, whether it proved to be nothing at all, or something far more threatening to the future she had spent years carefully building for herself. Corin found Damien in his study late that evening, still awake despite the lateness of the hour, staring at a map of the territory spread across his desk, without truly seeing any of the borders marked upon it. "You spoke with her," Corin said, closing the door behind him. "I did," Damien said. "I told her the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough for her to understand what has happened between us." "And how did she receive it?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, remembering the fear that had flashed across Elena's face, the way her hand had trembled even as the bond pulled them together. "She was frightened," he admitted, "more frightened than I expected. I do not think she understands yet what this could mean for her, only that it terrifies her." "That is not surprising," Corin said, taking a seat across from the desk. "You are asking a girl who has spent her entire life trying to remain invisible to suddenly become the most visible woman in the territory. That is not a small thing to ask of anyone, let alone someone with no family to prepare her for it, no one to guide her through what it means to stand beside a king." "I know," Damien said quietly. "I told her I would give her time. I meant it, but I worry that time is a luxury we may not have for long." "You are thinking of the council," Corin said, not a question. "I am thinking of everyone," Damien admitted. "The council, the families who have spent years positioning their daughters as potential matches, Lady Seraphine's family most of all. Word travels quickly in this palace, whether we intend it to or not. If this bond becomes known before I have had the chance to prove to Elena that it does not have to be something she fears, I worry what pressure that knowledge might bring down on both of us before either of us is ready to face it." Corin nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind his king's concern better than most. "Then move carefully," he said. "Give her the time she needs, but do not wait too long to prepare for what will come once the truth is known. It will be known eventually, my lord. Bonds like this rarely stay hidden for long, no matter how quietly you try to protect them." Damien looked out the window toward the servants' quarters across the courtyard, dark now except for a single lit window on the second floor, and wondered, not for the first time that night, whether he was doing right by Elena in trying to shield her from a truth that the rest of the palace would eventually learn regardless of his best intentions. "I will protect her," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Whatever comes, whoever objects, I will not let this bond be taken from either of us, simply because it arrived in a form the council did not expect or approve of." Corin said nothing more, but the look he gave his king carried the weight of a promise made in silence, a vow to stand beside him, whatever storm might follow. Neither of them yet knew how soon that storm would begin to gather, or how close it already stood to the quiet, frightened young woman lying awake in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling and turning the king's words over and over in her mind, unaware that she had already caught the attention of someone who intended to make certain she never reached the throne at all. 5 days passed before Elena worked up the courage to face Damien again. 5 days in which she scrubbed floors with unusual ferocity and avoided the eastern corridor near the private garden entirely, taking longer routes through the palace just to keep from passing anywhere near the king's usual paths. She told herself she was not avoiding him out of fear exactly, only out of a need to think clearly, though the two feelings had become difficult to separate the longer she turned his words over in her mind. A mate. Fate had chosen her, of all people, to stand beside a king. The thought still felt impossible every time she allowed herself to consider it seriously, and yet the warmth that had rushed through her twice now, once in the study and again in the garden, was not something she could easily dismiss as imagination or exhaustion. Something had happened between them. She did not understand it, and not understanding it frightened her more than almost anything else in her carefully guarded life. She was folding linens in the storage room on the 6th morning, when Ruth found her, breathless and wide-eyed in a way that immediately set Elena on edge. "You will not believe what I just heard," Ruth said, glancing over her shoulder, as though checking for eavesdroppers before continuing in a lowered voice. "One of the stewards told me, the king asked after you by name again this morning, asked whether you were well, whether your duties had changed recently." "Elena, why would the king be asking about you?" Elena's hands stilled over the sheet she had been folding, her heart beginning to race. "I do not know," she said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the whole truth. "Perhaps he confused me with someone else." Ruth did not look convinced, but she let the matter drop, too preoccupied with her own theories to press Elena further, chattering instead about which noble families had daughters of marriageable age, and speculating wildly about court gossip that had nothing to do with the truth Elena was carrying alone. Elena nodded along absently, grateful that Ruth's imagination had wandered somewhere far from the actual answer, though the relief did little to settle the unease building steadily in her chest. She could not avoid him forever. She knew that. And later that same afternoon, as she carried a tray of tea toward the council wing for an entirely unrelated task, she found herself face to face with Damien in the long corridor outside the library, both of them stopping abruptly at the sight of the other. For a moment, neither spoke. Elena gripped the tray tightly, uncertain whether to bow, to speak, or to simply hurry past, as she might have done with any other noble in the palace. Damien solved the dilemma for her, stepping closer with a quiet, careful expression that held none of the authority he usually carried through these halls. "You have been avoiding me," he said, not unkindly, though the observation still made Elena's cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I did not know how to face you again, my lord," she admitted, deciding honesty was easier than pretending otherwise. "What you told me in the garden was a great deal to accept all at once." "I understand," Damien said. "I do not fault you for needing time. I only wanted to see that you were well." He paused, glancing down the empty corridor before lowering his voice further. "Would you walk with me, if your duties allow it? Somewhere quieter than this hall." Elena hesitated, glancing at the tray in her hands, the tea now growing cold, the errand she had been sent to complete still unfinished. But something in his voice, some quiet plea beneath the careful composure, made her set the tray down on a nearby table and nod. They walked together toward a smaller courtyard near the library, one Elena had passed 100 times without ever truly seeing it, tucked away and quiet, shaded by a single large tree that had likely stood there since long before either of them was born. Damien gestured toward a stone bench beneath its branches, and Elena sat, still keeping a careful distance between them, though the space felt smaller than she intended it to be. "I have thought of little else since the garden," Damien said, breaking the silence first. "I know this is frightening for you. I know I am asking you to accept something that changes the entire shape of your life, and I know you have no reason yet to trust that I intend to make that change gentler than it might otherwise be. But I would like the chance to try, if you will allow it." Elena studied her hands folded in her lap, choosing her words carefully. "My lord, may I ask you something honestly, without fear of consequence, as you asked of me in the garden?" "Of course." "Why does this frighten you at all? You are the king." You could simply command that this bond be accepted, and no one in the palace would dare object openly. Why does my fear matter to you, when you hold every advantage in this? Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with more seriousness than Elena expected. Because commanding acceptance is not the same as earning trust, he said finally. I could force the council to accept you as my mate, through sheer authority, yes. But I do not want a mate who stands beside me out of fear or obligation. The bond gave us to each other, but it did not guarantee that either of us would choose to embrace what it offered. I would rather earn your trust slowly, even if it takes far longer than my counsel would prefer, than force an acceptance that leaves you as frightened of me in 10 years as you are today. Elena looked up at him then, surprised by the sincerity in his voice, and found herself, for the first time since the study, seeing him not as the distant, powerful king the entire palace whispered about, but as a man who carried far more uncertainty and loneliness than his crown ever let on. I did not expect that answer, she admitted quietly. Most people do not, Damien said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. Ruling a territory does not leave much room for anyone to see past the crown. It is rare that anyone bothers to ask what I actually think or feel about anything, beyond matters of policy and border security. Something in his words struck a quiet chord in Elena, an unexpected recognition. She too had spent years being seen only for her function within the palace walls, a set of capable hands to scrub and fold and carry, rarely asked what she thought about anything beyond whether the floors were clean enough. In that small, strange way, despite the impossible distance between their positions, she understood something of what he was describing. I lost my family in the border wars, she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she had fully decided to share them. She had not spoken of it aloud to anyone in 3 years, and yet something about the quiet courtyard and Damien's unexpected honesty made the confession feel almost natural. My village, near the eastern hills. It was destroyed the same year your father died. I do not remember all of it clearly, only fire, and my mother telling me to run. A trading caravan found me on the road and brought me here, and I have never told anyone the full truth of what happened that night, not even the housekeeper who took me in. Damien's expression shifted, something heavy and pained crossing his features. I am sorry, he said quietly. I have carried the weight of those wars for 5 years, the decisions my father made, and the ones I was forced to make in the chaos after his death. I did not know villages along the eastern hills had suffered such losses. I should have known. I should have done more to protect that region. You could not have known everything, Elena said gently, surprised to find herself offering comfort to a king. War does not leave room for anyone to protect everyone. They sat together in silence for a long moment after that, the weight of shared loss settling quietly between them, less like a barrier now, and more like an unexpected bridge. Elena found herself, for the first time since the study, no longer entirely afraid of the man sitting beside her. I would still like time, she said finally, breaking the silence. This is a great deal to accept, and I do not know yet what it means for my life, or whether I am capable of standing where you are asking me to stand. But I do not think I want to run from you either, not anymore. Something eased in Damien's shoulders at her words, a tension she had not noticed until it began to release. That is more than I hoped for today, he said. Take whatever time you need. I will not push further than you are ready for. They rose together and walked back toward the main corridor, the conversation shifting to lighter matters, small questions about her work in the Eastern Wing, about the friends she had made among the staff, about the small daily rhythms of a life Damien realized he knew almost nothing about, despite having ruled over the palace where she had spent the last 3 years of her life. Elena found herself answering more freely than she expected, occasionally even laughing at a dry observation Damien made about council meetings that ran too long, and by the time they parted ways near the library, something had shifted quietly between them, small but undeniable, a fragile beginning neither of them fully understood yet, but both seemed unwilling to abandon. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the far end of the corridor, tucked half hidden behind a marble pillar, her expression carefully composed into polite disinterest, even as her eyes tracked every step of their walk together, with sharp, calculating attention. Lady Seraphine had come to the library that afternoon on an entirely unrelated errand, only to find herself witnessing something far more useful than any book she might have retrieved. She watched Elena disappear down the corridor toward the servants' quarters, watched Damien linger a moment longer than necessary, watching the same direction with an expression she had never once seen him wear during any of their own carefully arranged encounters over the past 2 years. She had her answer now. Whatever was happening between the king and this maid, it was not a passing curiosity, and it was not something Seraphine intended to allow to develop any further unchecked. She turned and walked briskly toward her family's private quarters, already composing the first of several letters she intended to send that evening. Letters that would set into motion a series of quiet, careful actions designed to remind the palace, and the king himself, exactly who belonged beside the throne, and exactly who did not. By the time evening fell over the palace grounds, Elena had returned to her small shared room with a lighter heart than she had carried in days, unaware that somewhere across the courtyard, a woman with far more resources and far less patience than she possessed had already begun quietly working to ensure that whatever fragile bond had begun blooming between the maid and the king would not survive long enough to reach the throne at all. Seraphine did not waste time once she reached her family's private quarters. She dismissed her maid for the evening, locked the outer door, and sat at her writing desk with a fresh sheet of paper and a steady hand, despite the anger still simmering beneath her calm exterior. She had spent 2 years building goodwill with the right families, attending the right gatherings, positioning herself so carefully that most of the court already spoke of her as the likely future queen. She did not intend to watch that careful work unravel, because a servant girl had caught the king's eye during a moment of weakness. She began with a letter to her uncle, a senior member of the king's council, who had long favored her family's influence at court. She kept her words measured, careful not to accuse the king directly of anything improper, only to note, with practiced concern, that she had observed him spending unusual amounts of private time with a member of the household staff, time that seemed inappropriate given his unmarried status and the expectations the council had long held regarding his eventual match. She suggested, gently, that perhaps the council should consider addressing the matter of the king's marriage sooner rather than later, before rumors began to spread that might embarrass the crown. She wrote 3 more letters that evening, each to a different ally among the noble families who had long supported her position at court, each carefully worded to plant seeds of concern, without revealing the full extent of what she suspected. She did not yet know for certain that a mate bond had formed between the king and the maid. She only knew what she had witnessed, the closeness in their posture, the way Damien's eyes had followed Elena long after she disappeared down the corridor. It was enough to work with. Seraphine had built entire strategies on far less evidence than this. By the time she finished the last letter and sealed it with her family's crest, the candle on her desk had burned down considerably, and a cold, satisfied resolve had settled over her earlier anger. She would not act rashly. She would not confront the king directly, not yet, not until she understood exactly what she was dealing with. But she would ensure that the right people were watching closely, and that the maid named Elena Marsh found her days at the palace considerably more difficult than they had been before today. In the days that followed, Elena and Damien found small, careful ways to continue what had begun in the quiet courtyard beneath the old tree. Damien could not summon her openly without drawing the kind of attention neither of them was ready for, so their meetings became quieter, more careful, arranged through brief notes passed by Corin, or through seemingly accidental encounters in corridors where Damien happened to know Elena's usual duties would take her. They spoke of small things at first, the kind of ordinary conversations Elena had never imagined sharing with a king. She told him about Ruth's endless complaints about the head housekeeper, and he laughed, a genuine sound she had not expected to hear from him, low and warm and entirely unguarded. He told her about his childhood, before his father's death, before the weight of the crown had settled permanently onto his shoulders, about summers spent training in the yard with Corin, about a mother he barely remembered who had died when he was young, leaving him and his father alone to navigate the demands of court together. Elena found herself looking forward to these stolen moments more than she wanted to admit, small pockets of warmth carved out of otherwise long, exhausting days of scrubbing and carrying and folding. She began to notice things about Damien she had not expected, the careful way he listened when she spoke, as though her words carried genuine weight rather than simply filling silence, the quiet exhaustion he tried to hide behind his composed exterior, the loneliness of a man who had spent 5 years surrounded by advisors and nobles, and yet had almost no one who spoke to him simply as a person, rather than as a king. She did not yet know what to call the feeling growing steadily in her chest each time they parted ways, reluctant and slower than either of them intended. She only knew that the fear which had gripped her so tightly in the garden had begun, slowly, to loosen its hold, replaced by something she was not yet ready to name, but could no longer fully deny either. She also did not yet know that her name had already appeared in 4 separate letters sent across the capital, or that several members of the King's Council had begun quietly discussing, over private dinners and closed-door meetings, exactly how they intended to handle the matter of a palace maid who had somehow captured more of the king's private attention than any noble family's daughter had managed in 5 years of careful arrangement. The storm Corin had warned of was already gathering, quiet and patient, moving through the halls of power in whispers and sealed letters, rather than open confrontation. And somewhere within that gathering storm, Lady Seraphine waited with the patience of a woman who had built her entire position at court on knowing exactly when to strike and exactly how to make certain that when she did, no one would be able to trace the damage back to her carefully manicured hands. The first sign that something had changed came on a quiet Tuesday morning, when Elena arrived at the linen closet to find her usual set of keys missing from the hook where she always left them. She searched the small room twice, growing increasingly anxious as the minutes passed, before Margaret appeared in the doorway, with an expression far colder than Elena had ever seen the head housekeeper wear in 3 years of service. "A guest reported a missing bracelet from the Eastern guest suite last night," Margaret said, her voice clipped and formal. "You were assigned to clean that suite yesterday afternoon." Elena's stomach dropped. "I did not take anything, Margaret. I swept the floors and changed the linens, exactly as I was assigned. I never touched anything belonging to the guests." "That may be true," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she was far from convinced. "But the guard captain wishes to search the servants' quarters as a precaution. All of them, not only yours. Please do not leave the premises until this matter is resolved." Elena nodded numbly, her mind racing through every possible explanation as Margaret turned and left to relay instructions to the other maids. She had never been accused of anything in her 3 years at the palace. She had built her entire reputation on quiet reliability, on being the kind of servant no one had reason to question. The sudden accusation felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet without warning. The search, when it came an hour later, turned up nothing in Elena's shared room, nor in the rooms of any other maid on the Eastern Wing staff. The missing bracelet was eventually found later that same day, tucked behind a cushion in the guest suite itself, apparently having simply slipped from its owner's wrist, rather than being stolen at all. Margaret offered Elena a brief, formal apology for the inconvenience, and the matter was officially closed within a single day. But something about the incident left Elena unsettled, in a way that lingered long after the bracelet was found. She could not shake the feeling that the accusation had not been random, that someone had wanted her specifically to be searched, to be suspected, even briefly. She said nothing of this suspicion to anyone, not even to Damien during their next stolen conversation in the small courtyard, uncertain whether she was imagining threats where none truly existed. She was not imagining them. Over the following 2 weeks, small incidents continued to accumulate around her, each one minor enough to dismiss individually, but together forming a pattern that grew harder to ignore. A rumor began circulating among the kitchen staff that Elena had been seen sneaking into the king's private chambers late at night, a claim entirely untrue but repeated with enough conviction by enough people that several of the newer maids began avoiding her at meals. Ruth, usually her closest ally among the staff, grew noticeably cooler toward her, though she would not explain why when Elena gently pressed her about it. "People are saying things," Ruth admitted finally, one evening in the storage room, refusing to meet Elena's eyes as she folded a stack of towels with unusual focus. "About you and the king, I do not know what is true and what is not, Elena, but you have to understand how it looks. A maid, suddenly favored, suddenly summoned to private meetings, no one else is allowed near. People talk, and when people talk in this palace, it rarely stays harmless for long." "I have done nothing wrong," Elena said, hurt more than she expected by the distance in Ruth's voice. I believe you, Ruth said, though her tone carried more caution than conviction. But belief does not stop rumors, and it certainly will not stop whoever is spreading them. Be careful, Elena. Whatever is happening between you and the king, someone powerful clearly does not approve of it, and powerful people in this palace have ways of making problems disappear that have nothing to do with fairness. Elena carried Ruth's warning with her for the rest of that week, a cold weight settling permanently in her chest. She began noticing things she had not paid attention to before. The way certain nobles glanced at her with open curiosity when she passed through the main corridors on errands. The way conversations sometimes stopped abruptly when she entered a room among the household staff. The careful, deliberate distance several of her co-workers had begun keeping from her, as though proximity to her had become its own kind of risk. She mentioned none of this to Damien at first, unwilling to burden him with problems that felt, in the moment, too small and too uncertain to name clearly. But when he found her one evening in the small courtyard, looking visibly shaken after overhearing two nobles discussing her in cruel, dismissive terms just outside the library, he refused to let the matter rest. "Something is wrong," he said, taking a seat beside her on the familiar stone bench. "You have not been yourself these past 2 weeks. Tell me what has happened." Elena hesitated, still reluctant to add weight to his already heavy responsibilities, but the careful concern in his expression eventually broke through her resistance, and she found herself recounting the missing bracelet, the whispered rumors, Ruth's growing distance, the cold looks from nobles who had never once acknowledged her existence before this began. Damien listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each new detail, his hands curling slowly into fists against his knees. "This is not a coincidence," he said when she finished, his voice low and controlled in the way she had come to recognize as barely restrained anger. "Someone is deliberately trying to isolate you, to make your position here untenable before this bond has even had the chance to be properly acknowledged." "Who would do such a thing?" Elena asked, though even as she spoke the question, a name had already begun forming in the back of her mind, a memory of dark, watchful eyes she had noticed once from a distance during a feast, eyes that had lingered on her with an intensity she had not understood at the time. "I do not know for certain," Damien admitted, though something in his expression suggested he had his own suspicions he was not yet ready to voice aloud. "But I intend to find out, and I will not allow anyone in this palace to make you suffer for something that was never within your control to choose or refuse." "Please," Elena said quickly, placing a hand on his arm before she could stop herself. "Do not act rashly. If you confront whoever is behind this without proof, it will only confirm to the entire court that something is truly happening between us, before either of us is ready for that truth to become public. It may make things worse, not better." Damien's jaw remained tight, clearly frustrated by the restraint she was asking of him, but he nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her caution, even as every instinct urged him toward more direct action. "Then I will move carefully," he said, "but I will not do nothing while you are made to suffer quietly for a bond neither of us chose to create. I will find who is behind this, and when I do, they will answer for it, whatever their name, whatever their family's influence at court." They sat together in silence for a long moment after that, the weight of the growing threat settling heavily between them, though Elena found a strange, steadying comfort in the fierce protectiveness in Damien's voice, even as fear continued to coil tightly in her chest. Whatever quiet, careful beginning they had built together over the past weeks was no longer entirely private. Someone had noticed, someone with enough influence and enough patience to make Elena's life increasingly difficult without ever showing their hand directly. She thought again of the watchful, calculating eyes she remembered from that feast months ago, a woman whose name she had never bothered to learn because their worlds had never seemed likely to intersect, and wondered, with a growing unease she could not fully suppress, exactly how much worse things might become before whatever was coming finally revealed itself completely. She did not have to wait very long to find out. Lady Seraphine held a small private dinner that same week, inviting only 3 guests she trusted completely, each connected to families whose support she had cultivated carefully over the past 2 years. The dinner appeared, to any outside observer, like nothing more than a pleasant social gathering among old friends. In truth, it was a war council, disguised in fine china, and polite conversation. "The rumors are spreading well," said Lord Aldrich, a thin, sharp-eyed man whose family controlled significant trade routes along the southern border. The kitchen staff repeat them without needing much encouragement. People love a scandal involving the crown. "Rumors alone will not be enough," Seraphine said, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "The king has not confirmed anything publicly, and rumors fade quickly if they are not fed something more substantial to sustain them. We need proof of impropriety, or failing that, we need the girl to make a mistake serious enough that removing her from the palace becomes not simply reasonable, but necessary." "And if she makes no mistake?" asked Lady Wren, the youngest of the three guests, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes carried a keen curiosity about where this conversation intended to lead. "From what I have heard, she keeps to herself, hard-working, unremarkable, causes no trouble." "Then we will need to help create the mistake ourselves," Seraphine said simply, her tone as calm as if she were discussing dinner arrangements rather than the deliberate ruin of another woman's life. "Nothing severe, nothing that could ever be traced back to any of us directly. Only enough to give Margaret and her stewards sufficient reason to dismiss her from service quietly, before the king has the chance to formalize whatever foolishness has taken hold of him." The table fell silent for a moment, as the weight of her suggestion settled over the small group. Lord Aldrich was the first to nod his agreement, followed more slowly by Lady Wren, whose hesitation Seraphine noted carefully, filing it away for future consideration, regarding how much she could truly rely on the younger woman's loyalty when matters grew more difficult. "I have an idea," Seraphine continued, once she was satisfied of their agreement. "A piece of jewelry, something valuable enough to warrant serious consequences if found among a servant's belongings. Planted carefully, discovered by someone with no reason to be suspected of planting it themselves. It worked well enough as a warning with the bracelet, though the girl was fortunate that incident resolved too quickly to cause lasting damage. Next time, we will ensure it does not resolve so easily." Corin brought his findings to Damien 3 days later, his expression grim as he laid out what little he had managed to uncover through careful, quiet inquiries among the household staff. "I cannot prove anything directly," he admitted, pacing slowly in front of the cold hearth in Damien's private study. "But several servants have mentioned, in passing, conversations they overheard among certain noble circles, discussions about the maid that seemed far too detailed and far too coordinated to be simple gossip spreading naturally on its own. I have heard Lady Seraphine's name mentioned more than once in connection with these conversations, though nothing I have gathered would hold up as proof before the council." Damien's expression darkened considerably at the confirmation of his own suspicions. "I want you watching her closely," he said, discreetly. "If she intends to move against Elena, I want to know before it happens, not after the damage is already done." "I will do what I can," Corin said, "but be careful, my lord. Seraphine's family carries significant influence on the council. If you move against her without solid proof, you risk creating exactly the kind of political conflict you have been trying to avoid by keeping this bond quiet in the first place." "I am aware of the risk," Damien said, his voice hard with barely restrained frustration. "But I am no longer willing to sit quietly while Elena is made to suffer for something she never asked for and cannot control. Watch Seraphine closely, Corin, and warn me the moment you see anything that suggests she intends to act rather than merely whisper." Corin nodded and left to continue his quiet investigation, leaving Damien alone with a growing certainty that the fragile peace he and Elena had managed to build together over the past weeks was rapidly approaching its first true test, one that would arrive not from any external threat to his kingdom, but from within the very walls of his own palace. Orchestrated by someone who had spent years positioning herself for a throne she now watched slipping steadily further from her grasp. The accusation came on a bright, ordinary morning, exactly the kind of day Elena would never have expected her carefully built life to collapse around her. She had just finished delivering fresh towels to the western guest wing when Margaret appeared at the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 palace guards, her expression set in a hard, unreadable line that made Elena's stomach twist immediately. "Elena Marsh," Margaret said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar formality that stripped away any of the small warmth she had shown Elena over the years. "You are to come with us immediately." "What is this about?" Elena asked, her heart already hammering against her ribs. A ring belonging to Lady Wren was reported missing from her guest chambers this morning, Margaret said. It was found this afternoon, hidden inside a bundle of linens in the eastern storage room, the same storage room you were assigned to organize yesterday. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. I did not take anything. I have never taken anything in 3 years of service. Margaret, please, you know me. You know I would never. I know what has been found, Margaret interrupted, though something in her eyes suggested she was not entirely comfortable with the situation, despite her formal tone. This is a serious matter, Elena. The guard captain must investigate it properly. Come with us, and do not make this more difficult than it already is. Elena had no choice but to follow, her mind racing through every possible explanation, as the guards escorted her toward the guard captain's office in the western wing. She had not stolen anything. She had not even known who Lady Wren was until this exact moment, had never entered her chambers, had no reason to want a ring belonging to a noblewoman she had never met, and yet the evidence, whatever it was, had been found precisely where it would point directly at her. The guard captain, a stern older man named Ferris, who had served the crown for over 2 decades, questioned her for nearly an hour in a small, sparse room, his tone growing increasingly skeptical despite her repeated denials. Elena answered every question honestly, explained every moment of her schedule the previous day, insisted again and again that she had never touched Lady Wren's belongings, but she could see in Ferris's expression that her word alone, the word of a palace maid with no family name and no powerful allies to vouch for her character, carried little weight against the physical evidence of a stolen ring, discovered exactly where she had been working. You will remain in the servants' holding room until this matter is resolved, Ferris said finally, his patience clearly exhausted. Theft from a guest of noble standing is a serious offense within these walls. Depending on what further investigation reveals, you may face dismissal from service, or worse. Elena was escorted to a small, bare room near the guard station, the door locked behind her, and left alone with nothing but her racing thoughts and a growing, desperate fear that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She thought of the missing bracelet weeks earlier, the whispers that had followed, Ruth's warning about powerful people making problems disappear. This was no accident. Someone had planted that ring deliberately, and she had no way to prove it, no family name to lend her credibility, nothing but her own word against evidence that had been carefully arranged to condemn her. She sat on the small wooden bench in the corner of the room, pulling her knees up against her chest, and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at the palace 3 years ago, to cry openly, the careful composure she had maintained through years of hardship, finally cracking under the weight of an injustice she could not fight alone. Word of Elena's arrest reached Damien within the hour, carried by a breathless young page who had overheard the guards discussing the matter near the kitchens. Damien abandoned the council meeting he had been sitting through without a word of explanation, moving through the palace corridors with a speed and intensity that sent servants scattering out of his path. He found Corin already waiting outside the guard captain's office, his expression grim. It happened exactly as I feared, Corin said quietly as Damien approached. A ring, reportedly stolen from Lady Wren, found in the storage room Elena was assigned to yesterday. Ferris has her held for questioning. Lady Wren, Damien repeated, his jaw tightening. One of Seraphine's dinner guests, if I recall correctly, from the gathering you mentioned last week. The same, Corin confirmed. I cannot yet prove she was involved in planting the ring, but the timing is far too convenient to be coincidence. Damien did not wait to hear more. He strode into the guard captain's office, ignoring the startled protests of the guards stationed outside, and found Ferris seated at his desk, reviewing a report on the incident. Release her, Damien said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a king who expected no argument. Ferris rose immediately, bowing his head. My lord, with respect, the evidence against her is— I am aware of the evidence, Damien interrupted. I am also aware that Elena Marsh has served this palace faithfully for 3 years, without a single legitimate complaint against her character, and that convenient thefts have twice now been discovered, specifically in areas she was assigned to work, always resolved or investigated in ways that cast suspicion on her before any thorough inquiry has taken place. I want a proper investigation, Ferris. Question the guards who found the ring. Question who had access to that storage room besides Elena. Question whether anyone benefits from seeing her removed from service. Do this thoroughly, and do it before you consider any further action against her. Ferris hesitated only a moment before nodding, recognizing the futility of arguing further with his king in this state. Yes, my lord. I will begin the proper investigation immediately. And release her from the holding room while you do, Damien added. She will not flee. I will personally vouch for her presence for as long as this matter requires. Ferris's eyebrows rose slightly at the personal vouching, a detail that would not go unnoticed or unremarked upon once word spread through the palace. But he did not argue, unlocking the small holding room himself and allowing Elena to step out into the corridor, her eyes red-rimmed but her chin held with a fragile, determined composure. She startled slightly at the sight of Damien waiting for her, clearly not expecting him to have come personally, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid between them settling heavily in the narrow corridor. You came, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion she was struggling to contain. Of course I came, Damien said, stepping closer, careful to keep enough distance to remain appropriate in front of the watching guards, though every instinct in him wanted to close that distance entirely. I told you I would not let anyone in this palace make you suffer for something outside your control. I meant it. They think I stole a ring, Elena said, her voice cracking slightly. I have never even met Lady Wren. I do not understand why this is happening to me. I understand exactly why it is happening, Damien said, his voice hardening again with the anger he had barely managed to contain since hearing of her arrest. And I intend to find proof of it, whatever it takes. You will not be dismissed from this palace, Elena. Not while there is breath in my body to prevent it. Ferris, standing awkwardly nearby, cleared his throat. My lord, if I may, the full council will likely need to be informed of this matter, given the seriousness of the accusation, and now your direct involvement in halting the standard process. Damien's jaw tightened at the mention of the council, but he nodded slowly, understanding that the private, careful approach he had maintained for weeks was no longer entirely possible. Then inform them, he said. I will address the council myself tomorrow morning, and I will make clear exactly what I believe is happening here, and why. Elena's eyes widened with alarm. My lord, if you speak of this before the council, everyone will know. About the bond, about everything. They were always going to learn eventually, Damien said gently, turning to face her fully now. I had hoped for more time to prepare you, to prepare all of us, for what that truth would bring. But I will not allow you to be quietly destroyed by rumor and manufactured evidence while I hide the truth, to protect a timeline that no longer serves either of us. It is time the council understood exactly what is at stake, and exactly who I intend to protect, regardless of their objections. Elena said nothing further, too overwhelmed by the events of the day to fully process what tomorrow might bring, but she found herself, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest, grateful beyond words for the fierce, unwavering protection in Damien's voice, a protection she had never once experienced from anyone, since the night her village burned, and she had been left entirely alone in the world. That night, Damien sat alone in his study, long after the palace had gone quiet, preparing the words he intended to speak before the full council in the morning, aware that once spoken, they could never be taken back. Whatever careful, quiet path he had hoped to walk with Elena toward acceptance was about to give way to something far more public, far more contested, and far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated when their hands first touched over a dusty blue book in his private study weeks ago. He did not regret the decision, not for a moment, but he understood, with the clear-eyed certainty of a man who had spent 5 years navigating the treacherous currents of palace politics, that Lady Seraphine, and whoever stood with her, would not simply retreat quietly once the truth became known. If anything, open knowledge of the bond would only sharpen their resolve, and their methods, in whatever came next. The council chamber was already filled with quiet, tense murmurs by the time Damien entered the following morning, word having spread overnight that the king intended to address a matter of unusual importance. He noted Lady Seraphine's family seated near the front, her expression composed into careful, polite curiosity, giving nothing away, though her eyes flicked briefly toward him with a sharpness that told him she already suspected exactly what he intended to say. Damien took his place at the head of the long table and waited until the room had fallen fully silent before speaking. I called this session to address the matter of Elena Marsh, a member of my household staff, who was accused yesterday of theft, an accusation I believe to be false, and deliberately arranged to remove her from this palace. Murmurs rippled around the table. Lord Aldrich leaned forward slightly, his expression carefully neutral. My lord, surely such matters are for the guard captain to investigate, not the full council. They would be, under ordinary circumstances, Damien said. But this is not an ordinary circumstance, and I no longer intend to allow it to be treated as one. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before continuing. Several weeks ago, I discovered that Elena Marsh is my fated mate. The chamber erupted into a wave of startled exclamations, council members turning to whisper urgently to their neighbors, several faces paling visibly at the announcement. Damien held up a hand, waiting for the noise to subside before continuing. I understand this is not the match many of you hoped for or expected, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the last murmurs. I understand it complicates certain arrangements and expectations that have existed within this court for some time. But the bond is not something I chose, nor something I am willing to deny simply because it arrived in a form some of you find inconvenient. Since this bond became known to me, Elena has faced escalating harassment within these walls, culminating yesterday in a fabricated theft accusation, clearly intended to see her dismissed from service before this truth could be properly acknowledged. An older council member near the back, a woman named Lady Thorne, who had served the crown for decades and rarely spoke unless the matter warranted serious consideration, raised her hand slowly. My lord, these are grave accusations. Do you have proof that the theft was fabricated, or evidence pointing toward who might be responsible? Not yet conclusive proof, Damien admitted honestly, unwilling to overstate his case before the full council. But I have ordered a thorough investigation, and I intend to see it carried out fully, regardless of whose name it eventually implicates. I say this now, before this council, so that everyone in this room understands clearly that any further attempts to harm Elena Marsh, whether through fabricated accusations, spread rumors, or any other means, will be treated as a direct offense against the crown itself, and investigated accordingly. Seraphine finally spoke, her voice smooth and carefully measured, betraying none of the alarm she surely felt beneath the surface. My lord, no one here wishes harm upon any member of your household staff, but surely you understand the concerns this announcement raises. A mate bond with a servant of unknown lineage is unprecedented in recent memory. The stability of the crown, the confidence of the people, these are matters that deserve careful consideration, not hasty declarations made in defense of a single individual, however sympathetic her circumstances. The bond does not ask for the council's permission, Lady Seraphine, Damien said, meeting her gaze directly, watching carefully for any flicker of guilt or discomfort beneath her composed exterior. It does not care about lineage or political convenience. I would ask that this council extend Elena the same respect and protection any future queen of this territory would be entitled to receive, rather than treating her as a problem to be quietly managed. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence following his words, several council members exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unprepared to openly challenge their king on a matter he had framed so directly in terms of loyalty and protection. Lord Aldrich, sensing the shifting mood, chose a more cautious approach. We understand your position, my lord. The council will, of course, respect the bond and extend appropriate courtesy to Miss Marsh. We only ask that proper investigation into yesterday's incident be allowed to run its full course, so that the truth can be established clearly, for everyone's benefit, including her own. That is precisely what I intend, Damien said. I expect this council's full cooperation in that investigation, and I expect no further incidents of this nature while it proceeds. The meeting continued for a while longer, shifting into more mundane matters of territory administration. But Damien noted throughout the remainder of the session that Seraphine remained unusually quiet, her earlier composure never fully returning, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the door, as though calculating her next move, even as the current conversation continued around her. He could not yet prove her involvement in the ring's placement, but her reaction to his announcement had told him everything he needed to know about how deeply this news had unsettled her carefully constructed plans. When the council session finally ended, Damien found Corin waiting for him just outside the chamber doors, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "That went better than I expected," Corin said quietly as they walked together back toward the private wing. Though I noticed Seraphine did not seem particularly pleased by the news. "No," Damien agreed. "She was not. Watch her closely in the coming days, Corin. A woman who has just watched her carefully built plans crumble in front of the entire council is not likely to simply retreat quietly. If anything, I suspect she will grow more desperate, and desperate people make more dangerous choices than careful ones." "I will watch her," Corin promised, "and I will continue pressing the investigation into the ring. Someone placed it in that storage room, my lord, and I do not intend to let that person walk away unaccounted for, whoever they turn out to be." Damien nodded, his mind already turning toward Elena, toward the fear she must still be carrying despite his public declaration before the council, and toward the uncertain days that lay ahead, now that the truth of their bond could no longer be contained within the quiet, private corners of the palace where it had first begun to bloom. News of the king's announcement spread through the palace faster than anything Elena had witnessed in her 3 years of service. By midday, every servant in the eastern wing seemed to know her name, and by evening, whispers of the mate bond had reached even the furthest corners of the palace grounds, carried through kitchens and stables and guard posts with the particular speed that only truly remarkable gossip could achieve. Elena found herself the subject of stares everywhere she went, some curious, some openly hostile, a few surprisingly warm, particularly among the younger staff who seemed genuinely delighted by the romance of the story, however uncertain its outcome might still be. Ruth, to Elena's relief, sought her out that same evening, with an apologetic expression and an offer to help repair the distance that had grown between them over the past weeks. "I should have trusted you," Ruth said, sitting beside Elena on the edge of her narrow bed. "I let the rumors get into my head, instead of remembering who you actually are. I am sorry, Elena, truly." "You do not need to apologize," Elena said, though she squeezed Ruth's hand gratefully all the same. Everyone was confused. "I was confused too, and I am the one this is actually happening to." Ruth laughed softly at that, some of the old warmth returning to her expression. "Well, confused or not, you are about to become the most talked-about woman in the entire territory. I hope you are prepared for that." Elena was not entirely certain she was prepared for any of it, but the guard captain's investigation into the ring incident had at least begun in earnest, and the open hostility she had feared from the wider palace had, so far, remained mostly limited to whispers rather than open confrontation. She credited Damien's public declaration for much of that restraint, though she suspected the deeper, quieter threat, represented by whoever had orchestrated the theft accusation, had not disappeared simply because it had been named aloud before the council. In the days that followed, Damien made a point of spending time with her more openly than before, no longer confined entirely to stolen moments in hidden corners of the palace. They walked together in the private garden most evenings, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in long, winding conversations that stretched well past sunset. Elena found herself learning the small details of his life that the official portraits and formal titles never captured: his genuine love of horses, a habit of humming quietly to himself when he thought no one was listening, the particular way his shoulders relaxed whenever they were alone together, as though some invisible weight lifted the moment he no longer needed to perform the role of king for an audience. In turn, she found herself sharing more of her own history than she had ever intended to share with anyone. One evening, seated on their familiar bench beneath the old tree, she finally spoke in full detail about the night her village burned, describing the fire that had consumed the small houses along the eastern hills, the chaos of villagers fleeing in every direction, her mother's final desperate instruction to run and not look back, the years of aching uncertainty that followed as she wandered, alone, toward whatever safety she could find. "I do not know exactly who attacked that night," she admitted, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "I was young, and everything happened so quickly. I remember soldiers, but not whose banner they carried. I have spent years assuming it was simply one of the many raids that struck the border region during those chaotic years. Nothing more specific than that. Damien listened with quiet, focused attention, something troubled flickering behind his eyes that Elena did not immediately understand. "Do you remember anything else?" he asked carefully. "Any detail at all, however small, about who led that attack, or why your particular village was targeted?" Elena frowned, searching her memory for details she had long avoided revisiting too closely. "I remember my father saying something, before it all began, about a stranger who had visited the village weeks earlier, asking questions about the roads leading toward the capital, about troop movements near the border. My father did not trust him, though I do not know why. I was too young to understand what any of it meant at the time." Damien's expression grew increasingly troubled as she spoke, a cold, uneasy suspicion beginning to form in the back of his mind, though he said nothing further about it that evening, unwilling to burden Elena with theories he could not yet substantiate. Instead, he reached over and took her hand gently in his, the familiar warmth of the bond settling between them, steady and reassuring despite the weight of the memories she had just shared. "I am sorry you carried that alone for so long," he said quietly. "You should not have had to face something so painful without anyone to lean on." "I managed," Elena said, though her voice carried a fragile vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I learned to keep it buried. It was easier than remembering." "You do not have to keep it buried anymore," Damien said. "Not with me." Elena looked up at him then, something warm and unguarded passing between them that neither of them fully needed words to express. She found herself, in that quiet moment beneath the old tree, no longer thinking of the fear that had gripped her so tightly in the garden weeks ago, no longer calculating the danger or the impossible distance between a palace maid and a king. She simply felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely and completely understood by another person. "I am grateful for you," she said softly, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. "Whatever fate decided by bringing us together, I do not think I regret it anymore, even with everything that has happened these past weeks." Damien's expression softened into something almost boyish in its relief, a rare, unguarded joy breaking through the careful composure he usually maintained even in her presence. "Neither do I," he said, "not for a single moment." They sat together, as the last light faded from the garden, neither in any hurry to return to the separate lives waiting for them beyond its quiet walls, and for that brief evening, the growing threats gathering somewhere in the shadows of the palace felt distant enough to ignore entirely. But even as Elena finally allowed herself to feel something close to peace, Damien's mind kept circling back to the detail she had shared about the stranger who had visited her village weeks before the attack, asking questions about troop movements and border roads. It was a small detail, easily dismissed as coincidence in isolation, but combined with growing suspicions he had carried privately for years about the true circumstances surrounding his own father's death during those same chaotic border conflicts, it settled into his thoughts like a splinter he could not quite ignore. He said nothing to Elena that evening about the connections beginning to form in his mind. He wanted more certainty before he brought such painful possibilities to her attention, more proof than a half-remembered childhood detail could provide on its own. But as they finally rose from the bench and walked back toward the main corridor, his thoughts had already begun turning toward Corin, toward the old records from his father's reign, toward a truth he suspected had been buried for far longer than either he or Elena had realized, waiting patiently in the shadows of the past for the right moment to finally surface. Late that night, long after Elena had returned to her quarters, Damien made his way down to the old archive room beneath the western tower, a place he rarely visited except during the most tedious council research, dusty shelves lined with records stretching back generations. He lit a single lantern and began searching through the boxes marked with dates from 5 years earlier, the year his father died, the year the border conflicts had reached their bloodiest peak. He found what he was looking for after nearly an hour of careful searching, a thin folder containing the official reports from the eastern border campaigns, hastily compiled in the chaotic months following his father's death and his own sudden, unprepared ascension to the throne. He had read these reports once before, years ago, in the numb haze of grief and overwhelming responsibility, that had followed his coronation, and he had never found the strength or the inclination to revisit them since. He read through them again now with fresh eyes, searching specifically for any mention of the villages along the eastern hills, for any record of scouts or strangers reported moving through that region in the weeks before the major raids began. The reports were frustratingly sparse, clearly compiled quickly under pressure, but one detail caught his attention on the third page, a brief mention of an unidentified rider spotted near several eastern villages, weeks before the largest coordinated attack of that entire campaign. A rider who had reportedly been asking local farmers and travelers about troop positions and supply routes. The description was vague, too vague to draw any firm conclusions from alone, but it matched, almost precisely, the fragment of memory Elena had shared with him only hours earlier, a stranger asking questions about roads and troop movements, weeks before her village burned. Damien sat back in the dim lantern light, his mind racing through the implications. If the same scout had been operating in the region before the attacks began, someone within his own territory, or someone with detailed knowledge of his father's military positions, might have provided information that made those coordinated raids possible in the first place. It was not proof of anything definitive, not yet, but it was enough to reopen questions about his father's death that Damien had never fully allowed himself to examine closely during the chaotic years of establishing his own rule. He gathered the folder carefully and made his way back toward his private chambers, resolving to bring Corin into full confidence the following morning. If there truly had been a traitor operating within his father's court 5 years ago, feeding information to whoever orchestrated those devastating border raids, that same traitor might still remain hidden somewhere within the palace walls today, their true loyalties never fully exposed, even after 5 years of quiet service under Damien's own rule. The thought settled uneasily in his chest as he climbed the stairs toward his chambers, a cold certainty beginning to take root that the danger circling Elena might run far deeper and far older than a jealous noblewoman's wounded ambitions alone could fully explain. Somewhere within these walls, a much older betrayal might still be waiting, patient and unexposed, connected by threads he was only now beginning to see clearly enough to follow. He did not sleep well that night, his mind circling endlessly between the warmth of the evening he had shared with Elena beneath the old tree and the cold, unsettling possibility that her presence in his life might have reawakened dangers far older and far more dangerous than either of them had yet begun to understand. Corin listened without interruption as Damien laid out everything he had discovered in the archive room the night before. The old report of an unidentified rider asking questions near the eastern villages, the unsettling similarity to the fragment of memory Elena had shared about a stranger who had visited her own village weeks before it burned. When Damien finished, Corin remained silent for a long moment, his expression heavy with old grief that Damien recognized well, the same grief they had both carried since the chaotic months following the old king's death. "You believe someone within the court fed information to whoever orchestrated those attacks," Corin said finally, not quite a question. "I believe it is possible," Damien said. "I do not want to believe it. But the timing, the description, it fits too closely to dismiss as simple coincidence. If someone within my father's court was feeding intelligence to enemies along the border 5 years ago, that person may have played a direct role in the raids that eventually cost him his life." Corin's jaw tightened, old anger flickering behind his usually steady composure. "I have wondered about the true circumstances of your father's death more than once over the years," he admitted quietly. "The reports were rushed, incomplete, hastily assembled during a period when the entire court was in chaos. I always assumed that was simply the nature of wartime record-keeping. I never considered that the confusion itself might have been deliberately encouraged, to keep certain questions from ever being asked too closely." "We need to ask them now," Damien said, quietly. "I do not want whoever was responsible to realize we are looking until we have enough evidence to act decisively. If this traitor remained within the court after my father's death, they have had 5 years to establish themselves, to build trust, to become someone above easy suspicion." Corin nodded slowly, already turning the problem over with the careful, methodical mind that had made him invaluable to Damien's rule for years. "I will begin discreetly reviewing the records of anyone who held a position of influence near the border campaigns 5 years ago, and who remains active at court today. It will take time, my lord, This is not a search that can be rushed without risking discovery. Take the time you need, Damien said, but move as quickly as caution allows. I have a feeling, Corin, that whoever this traitor is, they may already sense that their old secrets are no longer as safely buried as they once believed. Elena, unaware of the investigation, now quietly unfolding around her own painful childhood memories, spent the following days settling into a strange new rhythm within the palace. The whispers had not entirely faded, but they had shifted in tone, curiosity replacing much of the earlier hostility as more of the staff grew accustomed to the idea that their king had chosen a mate from among their own ranks. Several of the younger maids had even begun treating her with a kind of awed respect that felt almost more uncomfortable than the earlier suspicion had been. She continued her regular duties, though Margaret had quietly reassigned her away from any tasks that might place her near noble guest chambers again, a precaution Elena appreciated, even as it underscored how precarious her position within the palace still remained. The investigation into the ring's placement had produced one useful lead: a junior steward who admitted, after careful questioning by Ferris, to accepting payment from an anonymous source to leave the storage room unlocked during an unsupervised window the previous afternoon. He claimed not to know who had paid him or what they had used the access for, only that the coin had been generous enough to overcome his better judgment. It was not conclusive proof against Lady Seraphine specifically, but it confirmed definitively that the theft accusation had been deliberately orchestrated rather than a genuine crime, a fact that further strengthened Damien's public defense of Elena before the council and further eroded whatever remaining credibility Seraphine's earlier concerns about the maid's character might have carried among more neutral council members. Elena found herself, for the first time since arriving at the palace years ago, beginning to imagine a future she had never previously allowed herself to consider, a life where she was not simply invisible staff moving quietly through someone else's grand story, but a person whose presence and choices genuinely mattered to the man who ruled this entire territory. It frightened her still, the scale of what such a future might eventually require of her, but the fear no longer felt entirely unwelcome, tempered now by a growing sense of possibility she had not experienced since long before her village burned. She was in the garden one evening, waiting for Damien to join her, as had become their regular custom, when she noticed a folded piece of parchment tucked beneath a stone near the fountain, clearly placed there deliberately for her to find. She unfolded it carefully, her curiosity quickly turning to unease as she read the brief, unsigned message, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Some fires burn longer than others. Ask the king what really happened to your village, and who truly benefited from its destruction. Elena stared at the note for a long moment, her heart pounding, uncertain what to make of the cryptic warning, or who might have left it for her to find. She was still holding it, turning the words over in her mind, when Damien arrived a few minutes later, his expression brightening at the sight of her, before immediately shifting to concern as he noticed the troubled look on her face. "What is it?" he asked, moving quickly to her side. Wordlessly, she handed him the note. Damien read it, his expression darkening with each word, a cold certainty settling over his features that told Elena, even before he spoke, that this message carried far more weight than she had initially understood. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Tucked beneath the stone, just there," Elena said, pointing toward the fountain's base. "Damien, what does it mean? Do you know something about my village that you have not told me?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal, before finally meeting her eyes with the same careful honesty he had shown her since that first afternoon in the private garden. "I have been investigating something," he admitted. "A possibility that has troubled me since you described the stranger who visited your village weeks before it burned. I found old records suggesting a similar figure was reported near several eastern villages in the months before my father's death, someone gathering information about troop movements and border defenses." Elena's breath caught. "You believe it was the same person?" "I believe it is possible," Damien said carefully. "I believe someone may have deliberately fed information to whoever orchestrated the raids along the eastern border 5 years ago, information that may have made your village's destruction, and possibly my father's death as well, far easier to accomplish than either should have been." "Someone within your own court," Elena said slowly, the pieces settling into place with painful clarity. Someone who has remained here, unexposed, for 5 years. I fear so, Damien admitted. Corin has been investigating quietly, but we have found nothing conclusive yet. And now this note suggests that whoever left it either knows something we do not, or wants us to believe they do, in order to manipulate us into acting rashly. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, a cold chill settling over her despite the warm evening air. Why would someone leave this for me? If they know the truth, why not simply tell you directly? I do not know, Damien said, his own uncertainty clear in his voice. It could be someone trying to help us, someone with information they are afraid to share openly, or it could be someone trying to sow further doubt and fear between us, hoping to use the pain of your past against you at the worst possible moment. They stood together in tense silence for a long moment, the peaceful evening they had grown accustomed to sharing, now overshadowed by the weight of old secrets and unresolved grief. Neither of them had expected to collide so directly with the fragile future they had begun building together. I want to know the truth, Elena said finally, her voice steady despite the fear still evident beneath it. Whatever it costs, whoever it implicates, I have spent 5 years not knowing exactly what happened to my family, assuming it was simply the chaos of war. If there is more to it than that, if someone deliberately orchestrated what happened to my village, I need to know. Then we will find out together, Damien said, taking her hands firmly in his. Whatever this traitor hoped to accomplish by remaining hidden all these years, I promise you, their time of safety within these walls is coming to an end. Neither of them noticed, in the deepening shadows at the far edge of the garden, a figure watching quietly from behind the hedges, their expression unreadable in the fading light. Having witnessed the discovery of the note and the private conversation that followed, with an intensity that suggested far more than passing curiosity in how the two of them would choose to respond to the fragile, dangerous truth now beginning to unravel around them both. Corin's investigation, carried out through careful conversations with retired soldiers and old palace stewards who had served during the previous king's reign, finally produced its first genuine breakthrough nearly a week after the note appeared in the garden. An elderly former quartermaster, long retired from active service and living quietly in the capital, remembered a detail from those chaotic border years that had never made it into any official report. There was a young clerk, the old quartermaster told Corin, over a modest dinner Corin had arranged specifically to draw out old memories in a comfortable, unpressured setting. Worked in the supply records office, back when your old king still ruled. Sharp fellow, good with numbers, trusted with a great deal of sensitive information about troop positions and supply routes for the eastern campaigns. He vanished rather suddenly, right around the time of the worst raids, if I recall correctly. Everyone assumed he had been killed in the chaos, along with so many others that season. No one ever found a body though. No one ever really looked very hard, given how many were lost during that period. Do you remember his name? Corin asked, keeping his voice carefully casual despite the quickening of his pulse. The old quartermaster frowned, searching his memory. Bertram, I believe. Bertram Hollis. Quiet fellow. Not much to look at. The kind of man you would walk past a dozen times without truly noticing, which I suppose made him rather well suited to handling sensitive records, without drawing much attention to himself. Corin thanked the old man warmly, and left the modest dinner with his mind already racing through the implications. A records clerk, with access to sensitive military information, vanished during the exact period of the worst raids, presumed dead without any confirming evidence. It fit the pattern of a man who might have faked his own disappearance after selling crucial intelligence to enemies of the crown, someone who could have simply resurfaced later under a different name once the chaos of that period had settled and old records grew less carefully scrutinized. He returned to the palace archives that same evening, searching through personnel records from 5 years earlier, cross-referencing names and positions with the current household and council staff. It took him several more days of careful, quiet searching before he found what he had been looking for, a records clerk named Bertram Hollis, who had indeed vanished from official service records exactly during the period the old quartermaster described, and a household steward named Edmund Vale, who had first appeared in palace employment records only a few months later, hired quietly into a mid-level administrative position through a recommendation from a noble family that had never previously employed him in any documented capacity. The physical description on Edmund Vale's original employment application, height, build, distinguishing features, matched closely enough with the sparse details available about Bertram Hollis that Corin felt a cold certainty settle over him even before he confirmed the final, damning piece of the puzzle. The noble family who had recommended Edmund Vale for his position 5 years ago was Lady Seraphine's own household. Corin brought this discovery to Damien immediately, laying out the full trail of evidence with the same methodical precision he had used to gather it. Damien listened in tense silence, his expression growing darker with each new detail, until Corin finally reached the connection to Seraphine's family. "You are certain of this," Damien said quietly, though it was not truly a question. "As certain as circumstantial evidence allows," Corin said. "I do not yet have proof that Edmund Vale and Bertram Hollis are definitively the same man, nor proof that Lady Seraphine's family knowingly employed a traitor rather than simply recommending someone unaware of his true history. But the pattern is too precise to easily dismiss as coincidence. Someone within Seraphine's household either knowingly protected this man 5 years ago or has remained deliberately ignorant of exactly who they were sheltering all this time." Damien rose from his desk and moved to the window, staring out over the darkened training grounds with a heavy, tired anger settling over his features. "If this is true, if my father's death and the destruction of Elena's village can truly be traced back to information provided by this man and sheltered by Seraphine's own family, then everything that has happened these past weeks, the rumors, the theft accusation, the note in the garden, none of it has been simple jealousy over a marriage prospect. It has been an attempt to keep this old betrayal buried, before Elena's presence in my life brought old questions dangerously close to the surface again." "That would explain the urgency of the attacks against her," Corin agreed grimly. "A jealous rival might content herself with rumors and social pressure over time. But someone protecting a secret, capable of exposing treason and complicity in the old king's death, would have far more reason to act quickly and decisively to remove the threat before it grew too dangerous to contain." Damien turned back from the window, his expression hardening with resolve. "We need proof, Corin. Enough proof to bring before the full council, enough to justify formal action against both this Edmund Vale and, if warranted, against Seraphine's family for their role in sheltering him. This cannot remain a quiet, private investigation any longer, not if lives may still be at risk." "I will continue gathering what I can," Corin said, "but my lord, if Seraphine or her allies sense that we are closing in on the truth, they may grow desperate. A person capable of orchestrating treason and murder to protect their secrets for 5 years will not hesitate to act more directly if they believe exposure is imminent." Damien's jaw tightened at the warning, his thoughts turning immediately and instinctively to Elena, to the note left deliberately for her to find, to the mysterious watcher who had observed their private conversation in the garden without either of them realizing they were being watched at all. "Then we move carefully, but we move quickly," Damien said. "I want additional guards assigned discreetly to watch over Elena's movements throughout the palace, without alarming her unnecessarily. And I want you to continue confirming whatever connection exists between Edmund Vale and Lady Seraphine's household, as carefully and quickly as caution allows. Whatever this conspiracy has been protecting for 5 years, I do not intend to let it claim anyone else before we finally bring it fully into the light." Corin nodded and left to continue his careful work, leaving Damien alone once more with the heavy weight of old grief and new, urgent fear settling together in his chest. He thought of Elena, likely already asleep in her small shared room across the courtyard, unaware of exactly how close the shadow of her family's destruction had drawn to the fragile happiness she had only just begun allowing herself to feel within these walls. Whatever peace they had found together beneath the old tree in the private garden, Damien understood now, with painful clarity, that it would not remain undisturbed for very much longer. The traitor who had helped destroy Elena's village and, quite possibly, his own father's life, still walked freely somewhere within these palace walls, protected by powerful allies who had spent 5 years successfully burying the truth. And now, with that truth finally beginning to surface, Damien feared exactly how far those same allies might be willing to go to ensure it remained buried for good. Seraphine received word of Corin's inquiries through a nervous informant among the household staff 2 days after Damien and Corin's late-night conversation, a young steward who had overheard fragments of conversation while delivering documents to the archive room and, recognizing the significance of what he had heard, brought the information directly to Seraphine in exchange for a generous payment. She listened to his report with carefully controlled composure, betraying nothing of the cold panic beginning to spread through her chest as she absorbed the implications. Someone had connected Edmund Vale to the old records clerk who vanished 5 years ago. Someone had traced the recommendation for his position back to her own family's household. Whatever careful arrangement she had maintained for 5 years, protecting a secret she had inherited rather than created herself, was rapidly unraveling in ways she could no longer control through simple rumors and carefully placed accusations. She dismissed the steward and sat alone in her private chambers for a long while, forcing herself to think clearly despite the fear clawing at the edges of her composure. She had been only 15 when her father first brought Edmund Vale, then still called by a different name she had never learned, into their household, under a cloak of secrecy she had not fully understood at the time. She had grown up knowing only fragments of the truth, that her family had provided crucial assistance to certain allies during the border conflicts 5 years ago. Assistance that had proven enormously profitable in the years since, through trade concessions and territorial adjustments granted quietly by grateful parties, who valued her family's continued discretion above almost anything else. She had never asked too many questions about the exact nature of that assistance. She had understood, in the vague way children eventually understand uncomfortable truths about the sources of their family's wealth and influence, that it was better not to look too closely at foundations that had been laid before she was old enough to have any say in how they were built. She had built her entire life, her position at court, her carefully cultivated reputation, on top of secrets she had not created but had certainly benefited from, and had continued, in her own way, to protect. Now those secrets threatened to collapse entirely, and with them, everything she had spent years building for herself. She summoned Edmund Vale to her private chambers, late that same evening, a risk she rarely took, given how carefully they had always maintained the appearance of nothing more than an ordinary employer and steward relationship within the palace. He arrived nervous and pale, clearly having already heard rumors that questions were being asked about his past. "They know," Seraphine said without preamble, once the door was securely locked behind him. "Or they will know very soon. Corin has been asking questions, connecting your current position to the records clerk who vanished 5 years ago. If this reaches the council with any solid proof, we are both finished, and my entire family alongside us." Edmund's face had gone even paler than usual, his hands trembling visibly. "I told your father, years ago, that this arrangement could never remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone would notice. Someone would ask the right questions. Your fear is not useful to me right now," Seraphine snapped, her own composure fraying under the weight of genuine desperation. "What is useful is a solution. If proof surfaces connecting you to the intelligence that made the Eastern raids possible, connecting my family to knowingly sheltering you afterward, we will both face treason charges. There will be no gentle resolution to that outcome, Edmund. Do you understand what that means for people in our position?" Edmund understood perfectly well, and the understanding seemed to steady him slightly, sharpening his fear into something closer to focused desperation. "The maid," he said slowly. "The one connected to all of this, the king's supposed mate. If she is truly from that village, from the eastern hills, she may hold memories, details, that could eventually corroborate whatever Corin is piecing together. If she disappeared before that connection could be fully confirmed, before she could offer any testimony to support the king's suspicions, the investigation might stall, without solid proof to build upon." Seraphine considered this coldly, the calculating part of her mind that had built her entire position at court, weighing the proposal with disturbing practicality, despite the darkness of what he was truly suggesting. "You mean to remove her from the palace entirely?" "I mean to ensure she is no longer available to answer any further questions," Edmund said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man accustomed to navigating dangerous territory without ever stating anything too directly. "Not permanently, if it can be avoided. Simply removed, until this investigation loses momentum without a key witness to sustain it. There are people I can still reach, old contacts from years ago who owe me favors and ask no unnecessary questions. Seraphine hesitated, some final remnant of caution warning her against the sheer recklessness of what he was proposing. Kidnapping the king's own declared mate, directly beneath his nose, within his own palace grounds, carried risks that dwarfed anything she had attempted so far. And yet the alternative, waiting quietly while Corin's investigation slowly tightened around them both, felt equally impossible to accept. "Do it quietly," she said finally, the words tasting bitter even as she spoke them. "No violence, if it can possibly be avoided. I do not wish for her death on my conscience, only her silence, and her absence, until we have time to properly cover whatever remains of this trail before it reaches the council." Edmund nodded, already turning toward the door, his mind clearly racing through the logistics of what needed to happen quickly to stay ahead of Corin's steadily advancing investigation. "It will be done within the week," he said, quietly, "as you ask. No one will trace it back to either of us, provided we move carefully and quickly." Seraphine remained alone in her chambers long after he left, staring at the locked door, a cold, hollow feeling settling over her that she refused to examine too closely. She told herself this was simply survival, simply protecting what her family had built, what she herself had spent years carefully constructing on top of a foundation laid before she ever had any real choice in the matter. She told herself Elena would come to no true harm, only inconvenience, only a temporary absence sufficient to buy the time they desperately needed. She did not fully believe her own reassurances, not entirely, but she pushed the doubt aside with the same practiced discipline she had used to build her entire position at court, brick by careful brick, over years of patient, calculated effort that she was not prepared to watch collapse now, not when the alternative felt so unbearably close to ruin. Elena noticed nothing unusual over the following 2 days, continuing her regular duties with the cautious optimism that had slowly begun returning to her since Damien's public declaration before the council. She spent her evenings in the garden with Damien as usual, unaware that additional guards had been quietly stationed throughout the palace grounds at his request, unaware of exactly how close the investigation into her family's destruction had drawn to a devastating and dangerous truth, unaware that somewhere within the palace, a plan had already been set into motion to remove her from the safety of these walls entirely. It was on the third evening, as she made her way alone, through a quieter corridor, near the eastern storage rooms on a simple errand to retrieve fresh candles for the servants' hall, that she first noticed something wrong. The corridor, usually busy with staff moving between duties, stood unusually empty and silent, the single lantern near the far end flickering unsteadily, as though it had not been properly tended. She slowed her steps, an old, instinctive unease prickling along the back of her neck, the same wary caution that had kept her alive on the road years ago after her village burned. She was reaching for the door to the candle storage when a hand closed suddenly over her mouth from behind, strong and unyielding, muffling her startled scream before it could fully escape. "Do not fight," a low voice murmured against her ear, calm and clinical, in a way that terrified her more than open violence might have. "This will go far easier for both of us if you simply cooperate." Elena struggled anyway, every instinct in her body rebelling against the hand restraining her, but a second set of arms wrapped around her from the front, lifting her feet entirely off the ground as a cloth soaked in something sharp and chemical was pressed firmly over her nose. The corridor began to spin, the flickering lantern light blurring into indistinct smears of gold against the darkness. And the last coherent thought Elena managed before consciousness slipped away entirely was a desperate, wordless prayer that somehow, somewhere, Damien would know she was in danger before it was too late. Damien felt it before anyone brought him word, a sudden, sharp wrongness tearing through the steady warmth of the bond he had grown accustomed to sensing quietly in the back of his mind whenever Elena was nearby. He was in the middle of reviewing reports with Corin in his private study when the sensation struck him, a cold, jolting distress that made him rise from his chair so abruptly the papers scattered across the floor. "Something is wrong," he said, already moving toward the door, his voice tight with alarm. "Elena, something has happened to her." Corin was on his feet immediately, Years of instinct honed through countless emergencies, moving him into action without a single wasted second. Where was she last? She went to fetch candles for the servants' hall, nearly half an hour ago, Damien said, his mind racing to recall the last ordinary detail he had known of her evening before the bond had torn so violently at his senses. The eastern storage rooms. They moved quickly through the palace corridors, Damien's long strides carrying him ahead of even Corin's practiced pace, guards falling into step behind them as word spread rapidly that something serious had occurred. They reached the eastern storage corridor within minutes, to find it eerily empty. The single lantern near the far end burned down to almost nothing, a small cloth abandoned on the stone floor near the storage room door, carrying a faint, sharp chemical scent that made Damien's stomach twist with dread, even before he fully understood its significance. She was taken, Corin said grimly, crouching to examine the scene more closely, his trained eyes picking out details Damien's panic had not yet allowed him to process fully. Recently, this cloth is still damp. Whoever did this cannot have gotten far. Damien's fists clenched at his sides, a fury unlike anything he had experienced since his father's death rising through his chest, cold and absolute. Seal every gate, he ordered the guards who had gathered around them, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for hesitation. No one leaves these grounds without thorough inspection. I want every corridor, every storage room, every servant's quarters searched immediately. And find Edmund Vale. Now. The guards scattered immediately to carry out his orders, and Damien turned to Corin, his expression a mixture of barely controlled rage and raw, desperate fear he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. If they have hurt her, he said, his voice low and dangerous, there will be nowhere in this territory safe enough to hide from what I will do in response. We will find her, Corin said, gripping Damien's shoulder firmly, offering what steadiness he could, despite the gravity of the situation. The bond you share with her is not severed, only disturbed. She is still alive, my lord. Trust that connection, and let us use every resource this palace commands to bring her home safely, before anything worse can happen. Damien closed his eyes for a brief moment, forcing himself to breathe, to focus on the faint, distant thread of the bond still humming quietly beneath the chaos of his fear, confirmation that Elena remained alive somewhere beyond these walls, frightened perhaps, but not yet lost to him entirely. He opened his eyes again, his expression hardening into the focused, unyielding resolve of a king prepared to tear his entire territory apart, corridor by corridor, if that was what it took to bring her home. Then let us move quickly, he said. Every moment we waste is a moment she remains in danger, and I do not intend to waste a single one more than absolutely necessary. Elena woke slowly, her head throbbing and her mouth dry, the sharp chemical taste still lingering at the back of her throat. She was lying on a hard wooden floor in a small, windowless room, lit only by a single lantern hanging from a low beam overhead. Her wrists were bound in front of her with coarse rope, tight enough to bite into her skin whenever she tested the restraint, and her ankles were tied similarly, leaving her with almost no ability to move beyond small, awkward shifts against the rough floorboards. She forced herself to breathe steadily, fighting down the panic threatening to overwhelm her, and took stock of her surroundings as carefully as her still foggy mind allowed. The room appeared to be some kind of storage cellar, wooden crates stacked along one wall, the air thick with the musty smell of old grain and dampness. She could hear faint sounds beyond the single door, muffled voices, and the occasional creak of footsteps on old wooden floorboards above her. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, no idea how far she had been taken from the palace, no idea whether Damien had even realized yet that she was missing. The thought of him not knowing, of him continuing his evening unaware that she had been taken, sent a fresh wave of fear crashing through her chest, sharper and more painful than the physical discomfort of her bindings. She closed her eyes and forced herself to think of the bond, the warm, steady thread of connection that had settled between them since that first accidental touch in the study weeks ago. She did not fully understand how the bond worked, whether Damien could truly sense her distress the way stories among the household staff sometimes suggested mated pairs could. But she focused on it anyway, willing whatever connection existed between them to carry some fragment of her fear and her location across whatever distance now separated them. The door creaked open before she could focus further, and Edmund Vale stepped into the room, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension evident in the tight set of his shoulders. He crouched beside her, studying her with the clinical detachment of a man accustomed to handling difficult situations without allowing personal feeling to interfere. "You will not be harmed," he said, his voice low and measured, "provided you cooperate and remain quiet. This is a temporary arrangement, nothing more." "Who are you?" Elena demanded, her voice shaking despite her effort to sound braver than she felt. "Why have you done this to me?" Edmund's expression flickered briefly, something almost like regret passing behind his eyes, before his careful composure reasserted itself. "You ask questions that connect too many things that were meant to remain separate," he said. "Your memories of that stranger, years ago, in your village. They threaten people who have worked very hard to keep certain truths buried." Elena's breath caught, the pieces from her conversation with Damien in the garden suddenly aligning with painful clarity. "You were the one who visited my village," she said slowly, horror creeping through her chest as understanding dawned. "You gave them the information that let the raiders destroy everything. You are the reason my family is dead." Edmund did not deny it, his silence confirming the truth more completely than any words could have. "I did what I was instructed to do," he said finally, his voice carrying a hollow, defensive edge. "I have lived with the consequences of that choice for 5 years, and I have no wish to relive them further. If you simply remain here quietly for a short time, this will end without further harm to anyone." "You killed my family," Elena said, her voice breaking despite her effort to remain steady. "You cannot simply undo that by keeping me locked in a cellar for a few days." Edmund rose without responding further, moving back toward the door with the careful, controlled movements of a man determined not to let guilt derail whatever plan he still intended to see through. "Someone will bring you food and water," he said, his back turned toward her now. "Do not attempt to escape. There is nowhere useful for you to run, and I would prefer not to make this more difficult than it already is for either of us." He left, the door locking heavily behind him, and Elena was alone once more in the dim lantern light, her mind racing through everything she had just learned, even as her body continued struggling uselessly against the tight bindings around her wrists. She thought of her mother's final words, telling her to run and not look back, and found a fierce, unexpected anger rising through her grief and fear, a determination that refused to simply accept whatever fate Edmund Vale and whoever he served had planned for her. She began working at the rope, binding her wrists with renewed focus, twisting and pulling despite the pain, searching for any weakness in the knot that her captor's haste might have left behind. Damien and Corin worked through the night, coordinating search parties across every district of the capital, questioning stable hands and gate guards, tracing the movements of anyone who had left the palace grounds in the hours since Elena's disappearance. It was well past midnight when a stable hand finally provided the breakthrough they desperately needed, recalling a covered cart that had left through the eastern service gate earlier that evening, driven by a man matching Edmund Vale's description, heading toward the old grain district near the edge of the capital. Damien assembled a small, swift team immediately, unwilling to wait for a larger, slower force that might give their approach away before they could act. He, Corin, and 4 of his most trusted guards rode through the darkened streets toward the grain district, the bond in Damien's chest pulling steadily stronger with each passing minute, a certainty growing in him that they were drawing closer to wherever Elena was being held. They found the old grain warehouse just before dawn, a weathered building at the edge of the district that had clearly been abandoned by legitimate trade for years, its exterior dark and quiet, except for the faint glow of lantern light, visible through a gap in one shuttered window. Damien signaled for silence, and the small party moved carefully around the building's perimeter, Corin identifying 2 armed men stationed near the main entrance, clearly guarding against exactly the kind of rescue attempt now underway. 2 at the front, Corin murmured. "There may be more inside. We move quickly and quietly, my lord. Speed matters more than caution now." Damien nodded, every instinct in him straining toward the building, toward the faint, steady pull of the bond, confirming Elena's presence somewhere within its walls. They moved in swiftly, Corin and 2 guards handling the men at the entrance with practiced efficiency before either guard could raise a proper alarm, while Damien pushed through the main door with the remaining guards close behind him. The warehouse interior was dim and cluttered with old crates and abandoned equipment, a narrow set of stairs leading down toward what appeared to be a cellar storage area at the far end of the main floor. Damien moved toward it instinctively, the pull of the bond growing sharper and more urgent with every step, and had nearly reached the stairs when Edmund Vale emerged suddenly from a side room, a short blade gripped in his trembling hand. "Stay back," Edmund said, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "I will not let you undo everything I have worked to protect." "Where is she?" Damien demanded, his voice carrying a cold fury that made even his own guards instinctively step back slightly. "If you have harmed her, nothing you have done to protect yourself these past 5 years will matter, because there will be nowhere left in this territory for you to hide." Edmund's hand shook further, clearly recognizing the hopelessness of his position, even as desperation kept him from simply surrendering. "She knows things now that cannot be unknown," he said. "About the raids, about who I truly am. If she lives to testify before your council, everything collapses. My family, Seraphine's family, everything we have built these past 5 years." "Seraphine," Damien repeated, the confirmation of what Corin's investigation had already strongly suggested settling into place with grim finality. "You will have every opportunity to explain her full involvement before the council, Edmund. But first, you will take me to Elena, unharmed, or I promise you, whatever mercy the formal justice of this territory might have offered you will no longer be available." Edmund's resolve finally broke under the combined weight of Damien's fury and the hopelessness of his situation, his blade lowering slightly, as the fight visibly drained out of him. "The cellar," he said quietly, gesturing toward the stairs Damien had already been moving toward. "She is unharmed, I swear it. I never intended real harm to come to her." Damien did not wait for further explanation, pushing past Edmund and descending the narrow stairs 2 at a time, his guards quickly securing Edmund behind him. He found the locked door at the base of the stairs and tore it open with strength born of desperate urgency, and there, in the dim lantern light of the small cellar room, he found Elena, her wrists finally free of their bindings after hours of determined effort, pressed against the far wall with an expression of fierce, exhausted defiance that melted instantly into overwhelming relief the moment she saw him. "Damien," she breathed, and he crossed the small room in 3 quick strides, pulling her carefully into his arms, checking desperately for any sign of injury, even as she clung to him with the same fierce relief he felt flooding through his own chest. "You are safe now," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "I have you. You are safe." "I knew you would come," Elena said, her voice shaking but steady with a certainty that surprised even herself. "I focused on the bond, and I knew, somehow, that you would find me." Damien pulled back just enough to look at her face fully, his hands framing her cheeks gently, as he searched her expression for any hidden injury or lingering trauma beyond what was immediately visible. "I felt it the moment something went wrong," he said. "I will never allow myself to be far enough from you again that such a thing could happen without my immediate knowledge." They made their way back up the narrow stairs together, Elena leaning heavily on Damien's steady support, as exhaustion and lingering effects of the chemical cloth finally began catching up with her fully, now that the immediate danger had passed. Edmund Vale stood restrained between 2 guards near the warehouse entrance, his earlier defiance completely gone, replaced by the resigned posture of a man who understood exactly how thoroughly his careful, secretive life had finally collapsed around him. "Take him to the palace dungeons," Damien ordered his guards, his voice hard and final. "He will answer before the full council for his role in my father's death, in the destruction of Elena's village, and in tonight's abduction. And send word ahead. I want Lady Seraphine and her father detained for questioning immediately, before word of tonight's events reaches them and gives either the opportunity to flee or destroy further evidence of their involvement." The guards moved to carry out his orders swiftly, and Damien turned his full attention back to Elena, wrapping his cloak carefully around her shoulders against the cool, early morning air, as they finally emerged from the warehouse into the pale gray light of dawn breaking slowly over the capital's rooftops. "It is over," he said softly, though the weight of everything still ahead of them, the council proceedings, The formal reckoning with Seraphine's family, the difficult process of fully understanding the truth behind his father's death, remained clearly present in his tired, resolved expression. Whatever comes next, you will not face it alone. I promise you that, completely and without condition. Elena leaned into him, exhausted, but finally, truly safe. The fierce, protective warmth of the bond settling steadily between them as the first light of a new day spread slowly across the awakening city around them. 3 days later, the full council assembled in the largest chamber of the palace, word having spread throughout the capital that the king intended to address matters of treason connected to events 5 years in the past, alongside the recent abduction of his declared mate. The chamber was filled beyond its usual capacity, nobles and council members alike crowding forward to witness proceedings that promised to reshape the political landscape of the entire territory. Lady Seraphine sat rigidly in her family's usual place near the front of the chamber, flanked by her father, both of their expressions carefully composed despite the guards stationed conspicuously near the chamber's exits. Edmund Vale, no longer permitted the dignity of standing freely among the nobility, was brought before the assembled council in restraints, his earlier defiance long since collapsed into hollow resignation. Damien rose to address the chamber, once the last of the assembled nobles had settled into uneasy silence. Elena seated beside him, in a position of honor that would have been unthinkable to most of those present only weeks earlier, her composure steady, despite the exhaustion still lingering beneath her carefully controlled expression. 5 years ago, Damien began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, my father died during the eastern border conflicts, and countless innocent villagers, including Elena Marsh's entire family, lost their lives in coordinated raids that struck with a precision our forces were never able to properly explain at the time. We now know why. Information regarding troop positions and border defenses was deliberately provided to those responsible for those raids by a man employed within my father's own court under the name Bertram Hollis, who vanished during that same period only to resurface months later within this very palace under the name Edmund Vale. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the chamber, though Seraphine's expression remained carefully controlled, betraying nothing beyond the tightness visible in her clasped hands. Edmund Vale's return to court employment, Damien continued, was made possible through a formal recommendation from the household of Lord Aldwin and Lady Seraphine 5 years ago. Whether that recommendation was made with full knowledge of his true identity and his role in the Eastern raids, or whether it represents a more recent, willful protection of a dangerous secret, this council will now determine through proper testimony. Ferris, the guard captain, stepped forward to present the evidence Corin had painstakingly assembled, the matching records, the testimony of the retired quartermaster, the confirmed connection between the recommendation letter and Seraphine's family seal. He then called Edmund Vale forward to give his own account before the full council, a formal testimony that Edmund, faced with the overwhelming evidence already presented against him, and the promise of somewhat more lenient treatment in exchange for full cooperation, delivered with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who had finally run out of reasons to continue protecting secrets that had cost him everything regardless. He confirmed his true identity as the former records clerk who had sold detailed intelligence regarding troop movements and village locations to agents working against the crown 5 years earlier, motivated by substantial payment he had used to fund a hasty escape when the scale of the resulting devastation grew far larger than he claimed to have anticipated. He confirmed that Lord Aldwin, Seraphine's father, had recognized him upon his return to the capital months later, and rather than exposing him, had chosen instead to shelter his new identity in exchange for ongoing loyalty and discretion regarding certain trade arrangements the family had profited from during those same chaotic years. He confirmed, with visible reluctance, that Seraphine herself had known at least some portion of this history since reaching adulthood, though he could not testify with certainty exactly how much detail she had been given regarding the full scope of the raids her family's secret had helped make possible. Finally, he confirmed, without hesitation now that the greater truths had already been exposed, that Seraphine had personally instructed him to orchestrate Elena's abduction only days earlier, upon learning that Corin's investigation had drawn dangerously close to uncovering the full truth of his identity and her family's role in protecting it. The chamber erupted into fresh murmurs and exclamations at this final confirmation, several council members turning to stare openly at Seraphine, whose careful composure had finally begun to crack under the combined weight of testimony and the visible shift in the room's collective judgment against her. "These are lies," Seraphine said finally, rising from her seat, her voice sharp with desperate denial, despite the overwhelming evidence already presented. "This man is clearly attempting to shift blame away from his own crimes by implicating my family in matters we had no true knowledge of." "Lady Seraphine," Damien said, his voice carrying a cold, unwavering authority that silenced the chamber immediately. "Elena Marsh herself can testify to the note left for her in the private garden, warning her cryptically about the truth of her village's destruction. A note whose handwriting Corin has already confirmed matches samples taken from your personal correspondence. She can also testify to Edmund Vale's own confession, delivered directly to her during her captivity, regarding the instructions he received to remove her from the palace before the investigation could progress further." Elena rose slowly beside Damien, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the chamber turning toward her. "He told me himself," she said clearly, "that he acted on instructions to keep me quiet, to prevent my testimony from strengthening the investigation against him and those who had protected him. He did not name you directly in that moment, but combined with everything else presented here today, I believe the truth is now clear enough for this entire council to see plainly." Seraphine's composure finally shattered entirely under the combined weight of the evidence, and Elena's calm, unshakable testimony, her earlier denials collapsing into a bitter, desperate silence that spoke more clearly than any further protest could have managed. Her father, recognizing the hopelessness of continued denial, slumped back into his seat, his face pale and drawn, as the full scope of his family's exposure settled over him. "Lady Seraphine Lord Aldwyn," Damien said, his voice heavy with the weight of the judgment he was about to deliver. "This council will convene formally to determine appropriate consequences for your family's role in sheltering a traitor, responsible for my father's death and the destruction of numerous innocent lives along our eastern border, as well as your direct role in orchestrating the recent abduction of my declared mate. Given the severity of these crimes, I expect the Council's judgment to reflect the seriousness with which this territory regards both treason and attempted harm against those under the Crown's protection." Guards moved forward to escort both Seraphine and her father from the chamber, her earlier calculated composure now entirely replaced by a hollow, defeated silence, as the full consequences of 5 years of carefully maintained secrets finally came crashing down around her. Edmund Vale was led away separately, his own fate left for the council to determine through the formal proceedings that would follow in the coming days. As the chamber slowly began to empty, the assembled nobles and council members, murmuring quietly among themselves about everything they had just witnessed, Damien turned to Elena, taking her hand gently in his, despite the many eyes still watching them from across the room. "It is finally over," he said quietly, echoing the words he had spoken to her in the early morning light outside the grain warehouse days earlier, though this time carrying the full, settled certainty of truth, rather than simply exhausted hope. "The truth is known. Justice, whatever form it ultimately takes, is now in motion. And you, Elena, no longer need to carry the weight of unanswered questions about your family's fate alone." Elena squeezed his hand tightly, exhaustion and relief mingling together in her expression as she allowed herself, for the first time in 5 long years, to feel the full weight of old grief finally beginning to settle into something closer to peace. "Thank you," she said softly, "for never once giving up on finding the truth, even when it would have been easier to simply let it remain buried." Damien raised her hand gently to his lips, a rare public display of affection that drew soft, approving murmurs from several of the remaining onlookers, an unmistakable sign that whatever resistance had once existed toward their unconventional bond had finally begun to dissolve entirely in the face of everything Elena had endured, and everything she had shown herself capable of enduring, with quiet, unbreakable strength throughout it all. The weeks that followed brought a steady, welcome quiet to the palace, a marked contrast to the turmoil that had consumed the previous months. The council's formal judgment against Lady Seraphine's family stripped them of their lands, and standing at court, their considerable holdings redistributed among families who had remained loyal throughout the territory's long recovery from the border conflicts. While Edmund Vale faced the full weight of the territory's laws regarding treason, a sentence that closed, at last, the painful chapter of betrayal that had shadowed Damien's reign since before he had ever taken the throne. Elena found herself, in the aftermath, adjusting slowly to a life that grew less frightening and more genuinely hopeful with each passing day. The whispers that had once followed her through the palace corridors had transformed entirely, curiosity and lingering suspicion replaced by a kind of quiet, growing respect that she had never expected to receive from the nobility who had once looked past her without a second glance. Ruth remained her closest friend among the household staff, delighting endlessly in recounting the dramatic events of recent weeks to anyone within earshot, though always with careful affection rather than gossip, proud in her own way of the woman Elena had proven herself to be throughout it all. Margaret, the head housekeeper who had once formally arrested her under Ferris's orders, sought Elena out privately one afternoon to offer a quiet, sincere apology for the role she had unwittingly played in the earlier accusations against her. "I should have trusted my own judgment of your character, more than the evidence placed in front of me," Margaret admitted, her usual stern composure softened by genuine regret. "You served faithfully under my supervision for 3 years, without a single true complaint. I am sorry I allowed doubt to override what I already knew about you. You were only doing your duty, given what you were shown," Elena said gently, having long since let go of any resentment toward the woman who had, after all, treated her fairly, once the truth finally came to light. "I do not hold it against you, Margaret. Truly." Damien, for his part, found himself navigating the delicate work of rebuilding the council's confidence in his leadership, following such a dramatic exposure of corruption within its own ranks, while also beginning the slower, more personal work of formally preparing for Elena's transition into her new role as his acknowledged mate. He spent long hours in council sessions addressing the redistribution of Seraphine's family holdings, the appointment of new advisors to replace those whose loyalty had proven compromised, and the broader work of reassuring the territory's people that the crown remained stable and trustworthy, despite the unsettling revelations of recent weeks. Through it all, he made certain never to let the demands of governance crowd out the time he continued to carve out for Elena each evening, their walks in the private garden becoming, if anything, more precious to both of them now that the shadow of immediate danger had finally lifted. They spoke often, in those quiet evening hours, about the future now opening before them, about what it would mean for Elena to formally step into a role that would require her to learn the intricate customs and expectations of court life she had spent 3 years observing, only from its quiet margins. "I am not certain I will ever feel entirely comfortable among the nobility," Elena admitted one evening, seated beside Damien on their familiar bench beneath the old tree, now beginning to show the first faint colors of autumn in its leaves. "I have spent so long being invisible among them. Learning to stand beside you, visible to everyone, still feels strange to imagine fully." "You will not have to become someone entirely different to stand beside me," Damien said, taking her hand gently in his. "The strength and honesty you have shown throughout everything that has happened these past months is exactly what this territory needs in its future queen, far more than any polished performance of noble manners could ever provide. I do not want you to become someone else for their comfort, Elena. I want you exactly as you are." Elena leaned into him, comforted by the steady conviction in his voice, and allowed herself, in that quiet moment, to imagine a future she had never dared consider possible during her long years of careful, guarded invisibility within these walls. The formal bonding ceremony took place several weeks later, once the immediate business of stabilizing the council and formally sentencing those responsible for the treason and abduction had been properly concluded. The great hall of the palace had been transformed for the occasion. Garlands of autumn flowers, woven through every archway, long tables prepared for a feast that would welcome representatives from every corner of the territory, come to witness the formal joining of their king to the mate fate had chosen for him. Elena stood at the entrance of the hall, dressed in a gown of deep blue that Ruth and several of the other maids had helped her prepare over the preceding days, each of them taking evident pride and joy in helping transform their former colleague into the vision of quiet elegance, now waiting nervously at the threshold. She could see Damien waiting at the far end of the hall, standing before the assembled council and nobility in formal ceremonial dress, his expression carrying none of the guarded distance she remembered from that very first morning in the study, replaced entirely now by open, unguarded warmth that steadied her nerves the moment their eyes met across the crowded room. She walked the length of the hall slowly, the assembled crowd falling silent as she passed, and found herself, remarkably, no longer frightened by the weight of their attention the way she once might have been. She had faced far greater fears in recent months than the simple act of walking toward the man she loved before an audience of nobles who had finally come to accept, however reluctantly some of them still might, that fate itself had chosen this match, and that fate's choices were not so easily dismissed by mere tradition or political convenience. Damien took her hands as she reached him, his thumbs brushing gently over her knuckles, as the officiant began the traditional words of the bonding ceremony, an ancient ritual passed down through generations of their people, formally recognizing before the community what the bond itself had already known since that first accidental touch over a dusty blue book weeks ago that felt, now, like an entire lifetime in the past. Do you, Damien, accept this bond fully, before your people and your ancestors, honoring the mate fate has given you? The officiant asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I do, Damien said, his voice steady and certain, fully, and without reservation, now and for as long as I live. And do you, Elena, accept this bond fully, before this community and whatever family watches over you still, honoring the king fate has given you? Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, thinking briefly of her mother's voice telling her to run, all those years ago, wondering if some part of her family truly did watch over her still, proud of the strength she had found in herself throughout everything that had led her to this exact moment. I do, she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the emotion thickening it, fully, and without reservation, now and for as long as I live. The hall erupted into warm applause as the officiant pronounced the bond formally recognized, and Damien, unable to contain his joy any longer, pulled Elena gently into his arms, the ancient warmth of their bond settling fully and completely between them now, no longer fragile or uncertain, but permanent, honored openly, before everyone who mattered to either of their futures. The feast that followed stretched long into the evening, laughter and music filling the great hall in a way it had not experienced in years, the entire territory finally allowed to celebrate something joyful after so many months, shadowed by the painful revelations of old treason and betrayal. Elena found herself, throughout the celebration, surrounded by well-wishes from nobility, who had once looked past her entirely, by the warm embraces of Ruth and the other household staff, who had known her simply as a fellow maid only months earlier, by Corin's steady, approving nod from across the room, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had all endured together to reach this joyful conclusion. Later that evening, when the formal celebrations had finally quieted and the great hall began slowly emptying of its guests, Damien led Elena out to the private garden one final time that night, the same quiet space beneath the old tree where so much of their fragile, careful beginning had first taken root. The autumn air had grown cool, stars scattered brightly overhead in a clear night sky, and for a long, peaceful moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing together beneath the branches, hands intertwined, the weight of everything they had overcome finally settling into something that felt, at last, entirely and completely like peace. I never imagined a life like this, Elena said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Not since the night my village burned. I thought I had lost everything that mattered, that I would spend the rest of my life simply surviving, quietly, unnoticed, waiting for nothing in particular. And now? Damien asked, brushing a strand of hair gently from her face. Now I know that fate was not finished with me yet, Elena said, smiling up at him with a warmth and certainty that had taken months of fear and courage to fully earn. It only needed time to bring me here, to you, and to everything we have built together since. Damien leaned down and kissed her gently beneath the quiet branches of the old tree, the same tree that had witnessed the fragile beginning of their bond weeks ago, now standing witness to its full, joyful completion. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, the palace continued its quiet nighttime rhythms, guards walking their steady rounds, servants finishing the last of the evening's cleanup, an entire territory settling peacefully into a future finally free of the old shadows that had haunted it for 5 long years. Elena, once only a palace maid moving invisibly through halls that had never truly seen her, stood now beside the Alpha King as his acknowledged mate and future queen, not because of any title or lineage she had been born into, but because of the quiet strength, honesty, and unbreakable resilience she had carried with her through every hardship life had placed in her path. And as she stood there beneath the stars, wrapped securely in Damien's arms, she understood, finally and completely, that she had found not only the mate fate had chosen for her, but the true home she had been searching for, without fully realizing it, since the very night she had first been forced to run alone into an uncertain and frightening world. The kingdom, at last, was at peace, and Elena, finally, was exactly where she belonged.